Scientology, The Fundamentals of Thought by L. Ron Hubbard. Forward. This thin book is a summation, if brief, of the results of 50,000 years of thinking men. Their materials, researched and capped by a quarter of a century of original search by L. Ron Hubbard, have brought the humanities, so long outdistanced by the exact sciences, into a state of equality, if not superiority, to physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Mr. Hubbard, an American, studied nuclear physics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., before he started his studies about the mind, spirit, and life. This explains the mathematical precision of the Scientology religion. What has been attempted by 1,000 universities and foundations at a cost of billions has been completed quietly here. This is how life works. This is how you change men and women and children for the better. The use or neglect of this material may well determine the use or neglect of the atomic bomb by man. Scientology is already winning in this field. In the same period in history, two of the most sweeping forces man has known have come to fruition: a knowledge of himself and others with Scientology, a means of destroying himself and all others by atomic fission. Which force wins depends in a large measure on your use of Scientology. Equipped with this book alone, the student of Scientology can begin a practice and perform seeming miracles in changing the states of well-being, ability, and intelligence of people. No such knowledge has ever before existed, and no such results have ever before been attainable by man as those which can be reached by a study of this brief volume. Give this book to a man or a woman in trouble, a man or a woman with an inquiring nature, a man or a woman with associates who need a better life, and let that man or woman study this volume carefully and apply it. Change and a better life will result. Scientology is today around the world, represented on every continent on Earth, with hundreds of millions of books in circulation. We trust you will find this volume of use, and hope that by placing it in your hands, you and many others can lead better lives. Note on translations. The text of this book was organized so that a complete translation of all of it would deliver, without interruption or destructive change, the basics of Scientology into every language. The difficulties of translation were most apparent when one was asked to translate Scientology who had not had years of experience with it. A translation not based on experience would then be colored by the various misunderstandings of the translator, and when the work passed, translated, into the hands of someone for use or study in that tongue, the person was deprived of much of the precision of Scientology. Thus, in order to secure exact meanings, all words and some phrases of questionable status in translation were given in synonym. Preface. Scientology and Scientologists are not revolutionaries. They are evolutionaries. They do not stand for overthrow. They stand for the improvement of what we have. Scientology is not political. When the fires of ideology threaten to consume us all, it is time to forget politics and seek reason. The mission of Scientology is not conquest. It is civilization. It is a war upon stupidity, the stupidity which leads us toward the last war of all. To a Scientologist, the real barbarism of Earth is stupidity. Only in the black muck of ignorance can the irrational conflicts of ideologies germinate. Government to a Scientologist is a thing of reason, and all problems of government can be resolved by reason. Perhaps in yesterday one could afford the exploitation of ignorance for the sake of fancied gain. Perhaps in yesterday the study of the mind and reason was something for a summer afternoon. Perhaps in that same yesterday one amongst us could afford his irresponsibility and hate. But that was yesterday. Today, exploited ignorance, a dilettante attitude toward existing knowledge, a refusal to assume one's role as a responsible member of the human race may be punished in the searing thunderclap of H-bombs released by men whose intelligence and statecraft were incapable of a better solution. Ignorant people elect ignorant rulers, and only ignorant rulers lead to war. And this time will lead to a war which will bring silence forever after to Earth. As your associates, their homes, their children, their possessions, and all their future lie ending in a radioactive street, there won't be time for us to wish we'd worked harder, been less easily dissuaded from pressing our arguments. The copies of this book you did not distribute will lie there too. Some say they have no fear of death until the midnight of their dying is at hand. They say different then. Those who strike at this work out of some black well of ideological misorientation, some anti-social cravenness, strike at the heart of man, for man has been a long time on the track to reason, and Scientology can take him there. There is not much earth time. We must work. The criminal is ignorant and stupid. Ignorance and stupidity may therefore be called criminal. Cause man to lay aside his hates and listen. Freedom from ignorance is at hand. Perhaps that was the kingdom of heaven. There is not much earth time in which to distribute this knowledge. This is the solution to our barbarism, out of which we would lose all. Scientology works. We must work, all of us, not to harangue man toward impossible freedoms, but to make man civilized enough to be worthy of his freedom. It is time man grew up. That is what we have in mind, for there can be but weeping in the night where ignorance, factionalism, hatred, and exploitation are served by the most ferocious and final weapon of all, the H-bomb. Change no man's religion, change no man's politics, interrupt the sovereignty of no nation. Instead, teach man to use what he has and what he knows to the factual creation within any political reference of a civilization on earth for the first time. And so we work. Scientology, questions and answers. What is Scientology? Scientology embraces and treats of human ability. The term Scientology is taken from the Latin word skio, knowing in the fullest meaning of the word, and the Greek word logos, study of. Scientology is further defined as the study and handling of the spirit in relationship to itself, universes, and other life. Dianetics is a forerunner and sub-study of Scientology. Dianetics comes from the Greek words dia, through, and nous, mind or soul. Dianetics is what the soul is doing to the body. Neither Dianetics nor Scientology should be confused with modern psychology. More acceptable and normal psychology, such as that begun by St. Thomas Aquinas and extended by many later authors, was, in 1879, interrupted severely by one Professor Wundt, a Marxist at Leipzig University in Germany. This man conceived that man was an animal without soul and based all of his work on the principle that there was no psyche, a Greek word meaning spirit. Psychology, the study of the spirit, then came into the peculiar position of being a study of the spirit which denied the spirit. For the subsequent decades, Wundtian quote-unquote psychology was taught broadly throughout the world. It taught that man was an animal. It taught that man could not be bettered. It taught that intelligence never changed. This subject, Wundtian psychology, became standard mainly because of the indifference or lack of knowledge of people in charge of universities. Scientology is actually a new but very basic psychology, in the most exact meaning of the word, a study of the spirit. It can and does change behavior and intelligence, and it can and does assist people to study life. Unlike Wundtian pseudo-psychology, it has no political aspiration. Scientology is not teaching dialectical materialism, the Marxist theory that all things are material, including the mind and spirit, under the heading of psychology. As has been the tradition for thousands of years, the study of the spirit and all spiritual matters rightfully belong to religion. Scientology, used by the trained and untrained person, can improve the health, intelligence, ability, behavior, skill, and appearance of people. The Scientology religion is precise and exact, designed for an age of exact sciences. Scientology is employed by an auditor, a Scientology practitioner. The word auditor means one who listens, a listener. The auditor uses a set of processes, drills, and exercises upon individuals or small and large groups of people in their presence. The auditor makes these people, at their choice, do various exercises, processes, and these exercises bring about changes for the better in intelligence, behavior, and general competence. Scientology is employed as well by business and government persons to solve problems and to establish better organizations. It is also employed by the average person to bring better order into life. How is Scientology used? Scientology is employed by an auditor, one who listens, a listener, as a set of drills, exercises, processes upon the individual and small or large groups. It is also employed as an educational, teaching subject. It has been found that persons can be processed, drilled in Scientology, with Scientology exercises, and can be made well of many, many psychosomatic illnesses, physical illnesses caused by the mind or spirit, and can become brighter, more alert, and more competent. But if they are only processed, they have a tendency to be overwhelmed or startled. And although they may be brighter and more competent, they are still held down by an ignorance of life. Therefore, it is far better to teach and process, audit, drill a person than only to process him. In other words, the best use of Scientology is through processing and education in Scientology. In this way, there is no imbalance. It is interesting that people only need to study Scientology to have some small rise in their own intelligence, behavior, and competence. The study itself is therapeutic by actual testing. Scientology is also used by business and government leaders to establish or improve organization. It is used as well by the individual at home or at his work to make a better life. Can a person use Scientology without much study? Scientology is practiced in daily life by enormous numbers of people who have no formal training beyond a study of textbooks. Scientology was developed to be used by such people as well as by the trained practitioner. A person studying by himself from textbooks can use Scientology to help his fellow human beings. Where is there more information about Scientology? There are churches of Scientology located on every continent throughout the world. Addresses can be found at the back of this book. Scientology practitioners are validated, certified, and given certificates by these organizations. Certificates are given only after very exact and precise training. A person who is skilled in Scientology has a certificate from one of these church organizations. These offices and these people can give you more information about Scientology. They have many books on the subjects of Scientology and Dianetics and the various services offered by churches of Scientology. Part 1. Basic Principles. Chapter 1. Basic Principles. Like engineering, Scientology has certain basic principles. These are necessary to a full understanding of the subject. It is not enough to know how to process, drill people in Scientology. To be effective, good, one must also know the basic principles. Scientology is very exact. The humanities, human studies, of the past were full of opinions. Scientology is full of facts that work. To study Scientology, one should scan quickly through the basics and find something with which one can agree. Having found one thing, one fact, with which he can agree, one should then skim through again and find another fact. One should continue to do this until he feels some friendliness to the subject. When one has achieved this, and only when one has achieved this, he should then study all the basic principles. There is no effort here to be authoritarian. No one will try to make the subject difficult. You may have been taught that the mind, spirit, and life are very difficult things to know about. This is the first principle of Scientology. It is possible to know about the mind, the spirit, and life. Chapter 2. The Cycle of Action. The most fundamental idea in Scientology is called the cycle of action. Cycle means a span of time with a beginning and an end, meaning a section of the totality of time with a beginning and an end, meaning in beginningless and endless time, one can set out periods which do have a beginning and an end, insofar as action is concerned. Action means motion or movement, meaning an act, meaning a consideration that motion has occurred. In very ancient books, it is written that from chaos came birth. From birth there was growth. When growth was achieved, there was then a gradual decay. The decay then ended in death. After death, there was chaos. Scientology expresses this more briefly. The cycle of action is an apparency as follows: create, then survive, then destroy, or creation, survival, destruction. First there is creation. This is then followed by survival. This is followed by destruction. Apparency means appears to be, as distinct from what actually is. This cycle is only an apparency. It is what we see, what we behold, what we believe. We consider, think, believe, suppose that it is so, and we then see it so. A child is born, he grows, he reaches manhood, he grows old, he dies. In Scientology, it can be seen that none of these steps are necessary. One considers them so, and so they are true. A man can grow old quickly or slowly. He grows old to the degree that he believes he is growing old. Because everyone agrees that this is the way things are, they go that way. The cycle is not true. It is only apparent. It is apparent because we believe we see it. It is apparent because we agree that it should be so. The test of this principle is as follows. By using the cycle of action, can we make anyone well or more intelligent? Thousands of tests have proven that the use of and belief in the cycle of action has made none well or intelligent. Therefore, no matter if we see it, there must be something wrong with it. The woman growing old, wishing to appear younger, is protesting this cycle of action. She feels there is something wrong with it. There is. We have to find out what the actual cycle is before we can make people better. Actual means what is really true, meaning that which exists despite all apparencies, meaning that which underlies the way things seem to be, meaning the way things really are. The actual cycle of action is as follows. Create, 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 counter-create, no creation, nothingness. Create means make, manufacture, construct, postulate, bring into beingness, meaning create. Create, create, create means create again continuously, one moment after the next, meaning survive. Create, counter-create means to create something against a creation, meaning to create one thing and then create something else against it, meaning destroy. No creation means an absence of any creation, meaning no creative activity. An actual cycle of action, then, consists of various activities, but each and every one of them is creative. The cycle of action contains an apparency of survival, but this is actually only a continuous creation, create, create, create. The apparent cycle of action contains destruction, but the actual cycle of action tells us what destruction is. Destruction is one of two activities. Destruction is, in terms of action, a creation of something against a creation of something else, create, counter-create. For example, a wall is seen standing. To be apparent, it is necessary that the wall be constantly created. The act of destruction is to exert against the wall another creativeness, that is, the action or activity of knocking the wall down. Both the wall standing there and the action of knocking it down are creative actions. Because we may object to or dislike a wall being knocked down, we vilify the creativeness involved in knocking it down with the word destructive. Actuality tells us that there is no such thing as destruction. There is only creation against a creation. There is another type of destruction, and this is no more creation, no creation. By no longer being a party to the wall's creation, the wall in theory can cease to exist for one. This is true in actual practice in Scientology. Reality means the way things appear, meaning reality is apparency. To do anything about reality, one must search into and discover what underlies the apparency. Of what does reality consist? What is reality composed of? We see an apparency which has the cycle of action of create, survive, destroy. More basically, this cycle of action contains nothing but creation. If one stops making something completely and ceases to be a party to its manufacture, it no longer exists for one. If one ceases to create, there is nothingness. When one creates something or beholds something which is created, that thing is still being created. Even if one is creating something with his left hand and has forgotten about it with his right hand, the thing still exists. In other words, one can create something without knowing it is still being created. Then one seeks to destroy it by a counter-creation, a creation against it. The result is a chaos created by two opposing creations. Let us be practical. A theory is no good unless it works. All the fancy and beautiful theory in the world is useless unless it has a use or a workability. Is this cycle of action theory useful? It is. So long as we believe that we have to destroy with force in order to destroy at all, as long as we think in terms of destruction, we have chaos. There is creating and knowing one is creating. There is creating and not knowing one is creating. When one drives a car or a cart, he does many things which he is not aware of, conscious of, knowing about, and these we call automatic actions. One is doing something and is not aware that he is doing it. One starts to create something, then places this thought, still active, beyond his own reach, and the creation continues to occur. Knowingly creating something is always the first condition. One can then purposefully continue the creation unknowingly. Everything one is doing, knowingly or unknowingly, one is doing here and now, in the present instant, in present time. One knowingly started any creation in some past moment, but the creation is being done in the present moment. To stop any creation, it can be established that one once knew one was creating it, finding that thought, and making it known again. Or one can simply create newly and consciously what one is already creating unconsciously, unknowingly. In either case, the creation stops. The wrong way is to start a new creation to counter against the old creation. When one does this, he gets confusion and chaos. For example, a man has a bad leg. He is trying to get well. He seeks then to create a good leg. He goes to doctors and wants to be healed. The treatment is difficult and usually somewhat unsuccessful in the case of a very severely crippled leg. Something is creating a bad leg. Against this, he is creating a good leg. The result is confusion and a bad leg. But a third creativeness is present. First, something was creating, we hope, a good leg. Then a counter-creation, such as an accident to his leg, counter-created a bad leg. Now he is trying to counter-create again a good leg. The result is to wipe out the original good leg, since that is the creation he is taking over and exposing with his efforts to get well. He wants a good leg. The trouble with him is the counter-creation of a bad leg. The test is factual. Have him create, by a certain Scientology process, bad legs, until the counter-creation of bad legs is wiped out and the original creation of a good leg will reappear. This only fails when there is no original creation of a good leg. For example, a man has a job. He works at it. That is to say, he creates a job throughout the days, weeks, and years. As long as he makes a job, the job exists. One day he depends upon, takes for granted, this job. He no longer creates it. It ceases to exist. He has no job. The apparency is that he loafed, became lazy, and was discharged. The actuality is that he no longer created a job and so didn't have one. For example, a man depends upon a woman to keep his house for him. One day he no longer has a woman. He can't keep house even though before he married the woman he could keep house. For example, a man is sane. He gets the idea, creates the idea, that it would be better to be insane. He starts to go insane, having created it, and then does numberless things in order to stay sane. Here, he was already creating the state of sanity. He counter-created insanity. He then counter-created sanity against insanity. Creation in this work may be thought to exclude God. We are here considering only those things which man or man as a spirit can make or manufacture or think. The subject of who or what is doing the creation does not invalidate the cycle. This is a work on the subject of the mind, spirit, and life, not a work on the subject of the Supreme Being. Lying is the lowest order of creativity. There are many tests for these principles in Scientology. Such tests come under the heading of processing. Chapter 3. The Conditions of Existence. There are 3 conditions of existence. These 3 conditions comprise, make up, constitute, life. They are be, do, and have. The first condition of existence is being. Being is defined as the assumption, choosing, of a category of identity. It could be said to be the role in a game. An example of beingness could be one's own name. Another example would be one's profession. Another example would be one's physical characteristics. Each or all of these things could be called one's beingness. Beingness is assumed by oneself, or given to oneself, or is attained. For example, in the playing of a game, each player has his own beingness. The second condition of existence is doing. By doing we mean action, function, accomplishment, the attainment of goals, the fulfilling of purpose, or any change of position in space. The third condition of existence is havingness. By havingness we mean owning, possessing, being capable of commanding, positioning, taking charge of objects, energies, or spaces. The essential definition of having is to be able to touch or permeate or to direct the disposition of. The game of life demands that one assumes a beingness in order to accomplish a doingness in the direction of havingness. These 3 conditions are given in an order of seniority, importance, where life is concerned. The ability to be is more important than the ability to do. The ability to do is more important than the ability to have. In most people, all 3 conditions are sufficiently confused that they are best understood in reverse order. When one has clarified the idea of havingness or possession, one can then proceed to clarify doingness or general activity. And when this is done, one understands beingness or identity. It is essential to a successful existence that each of these 3 conditions be clarified and understood. The ability to assume or to grant, give, allow, beingness is probably the highest of human virtues. It is even more important to be able to permit other people to have beingness than to be able oneself to assume it. Chapter 4. The 8 Dynamics. As one looks out across the confusion which is life or existence to most people, one can discover 8 main divisions, to each of which apply the conditions of existence. Each division also contains a cycle of action. There could be said to be 8 urges, drives, impulses in life. These we call dynamics. These are motives or motivations. We call them the 8 dynamics. There is no thought or statement here that any one of these 8 dynamics is more important than the others. While they are categories, divisions of the broad game of life, they are not necessarily equal to each other. It will be found amongst individuals that each person stresses one of the dynamics more than the others, or may stress a combination of dynamics as more important than other combinations. The purpose in setting forth this division is to increase an understanding of life by placing it in compartments. Having subdivided existence in this fashion, each compartment can be inspected as itself and by itself in its relationship to the other compartments of life. In working a puzzle, it is necessary to first take pieces of similar color or character and place them in groups. In studying a subject, it is necessary to proceed in an orderly fashion. To promote this orderliness, it is necessary to assume, for our purposes, these 8 arbitrary compartments of life. The first dynamic is the urge toward existence as oneself. Here we have individuality expressed fully. This can be called the self-dynamic. The second dynamic is the urge toward existence as a sexual activity. This dynamic actually has 2 divisions. Second dynamic A is the sexual act itself, and the second dynamic B is the family unit, including the rearing of children. This can be called the sex dynamic. The third dynamic is the urge toward existence in groups of individuals. Any group or part of an entire class could be considered to be a part of the third dynamic. The school, the society, the town, the nation are each part of the third dynamic, and each one is a third dynamic. This can be called the group dynamic. The fourth dynamic is the urge toward existence as or of mankind. Whereas one race would be considered a third dynamic, all the races would be considered the fourth dynamic. This can be called the mankind dynamic. The fifth dynamic is the urge toward existence of the animal kingdom. This includes all living things, whether vegetable or animal, the fish in the sea, the beasts of the field or of the forest, grass, trees, flowers, or anything directly and intimately motivated by life. This can be called the animal dynamic. The sixth dynamic is the urge toward existence as the physical universe. The physical universe is composed of matter, energy, space, and time. In Scientology, we take the first letter of each of these words and coin a word, MEST. This can be called the universe dynamic. The seventh dynamic is the urge toward existence as or of spirits. Anything spiritual, with or without identity, would come under the heading of the seventh dynamic. This can be called the spiritual dynamic. The eighth dynamic is the urge toward existence as infinity. This is also identified as the supreme being. This is called the eighth dynamic because the symbol of infinity stood upright makes the numeral 8. This can be called the infinity or God dynamic. Scientologists usually call these by number. The earlier subject, Dianetics, included dynamics 1 to 4. Scientology embraces dynamics 1 through 7 as known territory, scientifically demonstrated and classified. The difficulty of stating the exact definitions of the dynamics is entirely verbal. Originally, the dynamics read the urge toward survival as blank. As the subject developed, it became apparent that survival was only an apparency and only one facet of existence. Both the cycle of action and the three conditions of existence belong in each dynamic. A further manifestation of these dynamics is that they could best be represented as a series of concentric circles, wherein the first dynamic would be the center and each new dynamic would be successively a circle outside it. The idea of space expanding enters into these dynamics. The basic characteristic of the individual includes his ability to so expand into the other dynamics. But when the seventh dynamic is reached in its entirety, one will only then discover the true eighth dynamic. As an example of use of these dynamics, one discovers that a baby at birth is not perceptive beyond the first dynamic, but as the child grows and interests extend, the child can be seen to embrace other dynamics. As a further example of use, a person who is incapable of operating on the third dynamic is incapable at once of being a part of a team, and so might be said to be incapable of a social existence. As a further comment upon the 8 dynamics, no one of these dynamics, from 1 to 7, is more important than any other one of them in terms of orienting the individual. While the dynamics are not of equal importance, one to the next, the ability of an individual to assume the beingness, doingness, and havingness of each dynamic is an index to his ability to live. The 8 dynamics are used in Scientology communication and should be perfectly learned as part of the language of Scientology. The abilities and shortcomings of individuals can be understood by viewing their participation in the various dynamics. Chapter 5. The ARC Triangle. There is a triangle of considerable importance in Scientology, and an ability to use it gives a much greater understanding of life. The ARC triangle is the keystone of living associations. This triangle is the common denominator to all of life's activities. The first corner of the triangle is called affinity. The basic definition of affinity is the consideration of distance, whether good or bad. The most basic function of complete affinity would be the ability to occupy the same space as something else. The word affinity is here used to mean love, liking, or any other emotional attitude. Affinity is conceived in Scientology to be something of many facets. Affinity is a variable quality. Affinity is here used as a word with the context degree of liking. Under affinity, we have the various emotional tones ranged from the highest to the lowest, and these are in part serenity, the highest level, enthusiasm, conservatism, as we proceed downward towards the baser affinities, boredom, antagonism, anger, covert hostility, fear, grief, apathy. This in Scientology is called the tone scale. Below apathy, affinity proceeds into solidities such as matter. Affinity is conceived to be comprised first of thought, then of emotion, which contains energy particles, and then as a solid. The second corner of the triangle is reality. Reality could be defined as that which appears to be. Reality is fundamentally agreement. What we agree to be real is real. The third corner of the triangle is communication. In understanding the composition of human relations in this universe, communication is more important than the other 2 corners of the triangle. Communication is the solvent for all things. It dissolves all things. The interrelationship of the triangle becomes apparent at once when one asks, "Have you ever tried to talk to an angry man?" Without a high degree of liking and without some basis of agreement, there is no communication. Without communication and some basis of emotional response, there can be no reality. Without some basis for agreement and communication, there can be no affinity. Thus, we call these 3 things a triangle. Unless we have 2 corners of a triangle, there cannot be a third corner. Desiring any corner of the triangle, one must include the other 2. The triangle is conceived to be very spacious at the level of serenity and completely condensed at the level of matter. Thus, to represent a scale for use, one would draw a large triangle with the high part of the scale and succeedingly smaller triangles down to a dot at the bottom of the scale. Affinity, reality, and communication are the basis of the Scientology tone scale, which gives a prediction of human behavior. The tone scale, its complete description and use, is contained in Science of Survival. As has already been noted, the triangle is not an equilateral, all sides the same, triangle. Affinity and reality are very much less important than communication. It might be said that the triangle begins with communication, which brings into existence affinity and reality. ARC, understanding. If you would continue a strong and able communication with someone, there must be some basis for agreement. There must be some liking for the person, and then communication can exist. We can see then that simple talking and writing randomly without knowledge of this would not necessarily be communication. Communication is essentially something which is sent and which is received. The intention to send and the intention to receive must both be present in some degree before an actual communication can take place. Therefore, one could have conditions which appear to be communications which were not. The complete manual of communication is Dianetics 55. Original with Scientology, as are all these concepts, the ARC triangle, understood, is an extremely useful tool or weapon in human relationships. For instance, amongst the ARC triangle laws, a communication to be received must approximate the affinity level of the person to whom it is directed. As people descend the tone scale, they become more and more difficult to communicate with, and things with which they will agree become more and more solid. Thus, we have friendly discourses high on the scale and war at the bottom. Where the affinity level is hate, the agreement is solid matter, and the communication, bullets. Chapter 6. The Reason Why. Life can best be understood by likening it to a game. Since we are exterior to a great number of games, we can regard them with a detached eye. If we were exterior to life, instead of being involved and immersed in the living of it, it would look to us much like games look to us from our present vantage point. Despite the amount of suffering, pain, misery, sorrow, and travail which can exist in life, the reason for existence is the same reason as one has to play a game: interest, contest, activity, and possession. The truth of this assertion is established by an observation of the elements of games and then applying these elements to life itself. When we do this, we find nothing left wanting in the panorama of life. By game, we mean contest of person against person or team against team. When we say games, we mean such games as baseball, polo, chess, or any other such pastime. It may at one time have struck you peculiar that men would risk bodily injury in the field of play just for the sake of amusement. So it might strike you as peculiar that people would go on living or would enter into the game of life at the risk of all the sorrow, travail, and pain just to have something to do. Evidently, there is no greater curse than total idleness. Of course, there is that condition where a person continues to play a game in which he is no longer interested. If you will but look about the room and check off items in which you are not interested, you will discover something remarkable. In a short time, you will find that there is nothing in the room in which you are not interested. You are interested in everything. However, disinterest itself is one of the mechanisms of play. In order to hide something, it is only necessary to make everyone disinterested in the place where the item is hidden. Disinterest is not an immediate result of interest which has worn out. Disinterest is a commodity in itself. It is palpable. It exists. By studying the elements of games, we find ourselves in possession of the elements of life. Life is a game. A game consists of freedom, barriers, and purposes. This is a scientific fact, not merely an observation. Freedom exists amongst barriers. A totality of barriers and a totality of freedom alike are no-game conditions. Each is similarly cruel. Each is similarly purposeless. Great revolutionary movements fail. They promise unlimited freedom. That is the road to failure. Only stupid visionaries chant of endless freedom. Only the afraid and ignorant speak of and insist upon unlimited barriers. When the relation between freedom and barriers becomes too unbalanced, an unhappiness results. Freedom from is all right, only so long as there is a place to be free to. An endless desire for freedom from is a perfect trap, a fear of all things. Barriers are composed of inhibiting, limiting ideas, space, energy, masses, and time. Freedom in its entirety would be a total absence of these things. But it would also be a freedom without thought or action, an unhappy condition of total nothingness. Fixed on too many barriers, man yearns to be free. But launched into total freedom, he is purposeless and miserable. There is freedom amongst barriers. If the barriers are known and the freedoms are known, there can be life, living, happiness, a game. The restrictions of a government or a job give an employee his freedom. Without known restrictions, an employee is a slave doomed to the fears of uncertainty in all his actions. Executives in business and government can fail in 3 ways and thus bring about a chaos in their department. They can 1. Seem to give endless freedom, 2. Seem to give endless barriers, 3. Make neither freedom nor barriers certain. Executive competence, therefore, consists of imposing and enforcing an adequate balance between their people's freedom and the unit's barriers, and in being precise and consistent about those freedoms and barriers. Such an executive, adding only in himself initiative and purpose, can have a department with initiative and purpose. An employee buying and or insisting upon freedom only will become a slave. Knowing the above facts, he must insist upon a workable balance between freedom and barriers. An examination of the dynamics, Chapter 4, will demonstrate the possibility of a combination of teams. 2 group dynamics can engage one another as teams. The self dynamic can ally itself with the animal dynamic against, let us say, the universe dynamic, and so have a game. In other words, the dynamics are an outline of possible teams and interplays. As everyone is engaged in several games, an examination of the dynamics will plot and clarify for him the various teams he is playing upon and those he is playing against. If an individual can discover that he is only playing on the self-dynamic and that he belongs to no other team, it is certain that this individual will lose. For he has before him 7 remaining dynamics, and the self-dynamic is seldom capable of besting, by itself, all the remaining dynamics. In Scientology, we call this condition the only one. Here is self-determinism in the guise of selfish determinism. And here is an individual who will most certainly be overwhelmed. To enjoy life, one must be willing to be some part of life. There is the principle in Scientology called pan-determinism. This could be loosely defined as determining the activities of 2 or more sides in a game simultaneously. For instance, a person playing chess is being self-determined and is playing chess against an opponent. A person who is pan-determined on the subject of chess could play both sides of the board. A being is pan-determined about any game to which he is senior. He is self-determined only in a game to which he is junior. For instance, a general of an army is pan-determined concerning an argument between 2 privates or even 2 companies of his command. He is pan-determined in this case, but when he confronts another army led by another general, he becomes self-determined. The game in this wise could be said to be larger than himself. The game becomes even larger than this when the general seeks to play the parts of all the political heads which should be above him. This is the main reason why dictatorship doesn't work. It is all but impossible for one man to be pan-determined about the entire system of games which comprise a nation. He starts taking sides, and then, to that degree, becomes much less than the government which he is seeking to run. It has been stylish in past ages to insist only upon freedom. The French Revolution furnishes an excellent example for this. In the late part of the 18th century, the nobles of France became so self-determined against the remainder of the country and were so incapable of taking the parts of the populace that the nobles were destroyed. Immediately, the populace itself sought to take over the government. And being untrained and being intensely antipathetic to any and all restraints, their war cry became freedom. They had no further restrictions or barriers. The rules of government were thrown aside. Theft and brigandage took the place of economics. The populace, therefore, found itself in a deeper trap and discovered itself to be involved with a dictatorship which was far more restrictive than anything they had experienced before the Revolution. Although man continually uses freedom for his war cry, he only succeeds in establishing further entrapment for himself. The reason for this is a very simple one. A game consists of freedom and barriers and purposes. When man drops the idea of restrictions or barriers, he loses at once control over barriers. He becomes self-determined about barriers and not pan-determined. Thus, he cannot control the barriers. The barriers left uncontrolled trap him then and there. The dwindling spiral of the apparency create, survive, destroy comes about directly when man shuns barriers. If he considers all restrictions and barriers his enemies, he is, of course, refusing to control them in any way, and thus he starts his own dwindling spiral. A race which is educated to think in terms of freedom only is very easily entrapped. No one in the nation will take responsibility for restrictions. Therefore, restrictions apparently become less and less. Actually, they become more and more. As these restrictions lessen, so lessens the freedom of the individual. One cannot be free from a wall unless there is a wall. Lacking any restrictions, life becomes purposeless, random, chaotic. A good manager must be capable of taking responsibility for restrictions. In that freedom, to exist, must have barriers. A failure to take initiative on the subject of restrictions or barriers causes them to arise all by themselves and exist without consent or direction. There are various states of mind which bring about happiness. That state of mind which insists only upon freedom can bring about nothing but unhappiness. It would be better to develop a thought pattern which looked for new ways to be entrapped and things to be trapped in than to suffer the eventual total entrapment of dwelling upon freedom only. A man who is willing to accept restrictions and barriers and is not afraid of them is free. A man who does nothing but fight restrictions and barriers will usually be trapped. The way to have endless war is abandon all war. As it can be seen in any game, purposes become counterposed. There is a matter of purpose, counterpurpose in almost any game played in a field with two teams. One team has the idea of reaching the goal of the other, and the other has the idea of reaching the goal of the first. Their purposes are at war, and this warring of purposes makes a game. The war of purposes gives us what we call problems. A problem has the anatomy of purposes. A problem consists of two or more purposes opposed. It does not matter what problem you face or have faced. The basic anatomy of that problem is purpose, counterpurpose. In actual testing, in Scientology, it has been discovered that a person begins to suffer from problems when he does not have enough of them. There is the old maxim that if you want a thing done, give it to a busy man to do. Similarly, if you want a happy associate, make sure that he is a man who can have lots of problems. From this, we get the oddity of a high incidence of neurosis in the families of the rich. These people have very little to do and have very few problems. The basic problems of food, clothing, and shelter are already solved for them. We would suppose, then, if it were true that an individual's happiness depended only upon his freedom, these people would be happy. However, they are not happy. What brings about their unhappiness? It is the lack of problems. Although successful processing in Scientology would depend upon taking all three elements of games into consideration, and indeed that is the secret of bettering people, taking freedom, barriers, and purposes into consideration and balancing them, it is true that you could make a man well simply by sitting down with him and asking him to invent problems one after the other. The invention of synthetic problems would be found to free his mind and make him more able. Of course, there is another factor involved in this. In that it is he who is inventing the problems, he is therefore becoming pan-determined about problems rather than being in one place with all problems opposed to him. An unhappy man is one who is considering continually how to become free. One sees this in the clerk who is continually trying to avoid work. Although he has a great deal of leisure time, he is not enjoying any part of it. He is trying to avoid contact with people, objects, energies, and spaces. He eventually becomes trapped in a sort of lethargy. If this man could merely change his mind and start worrying about how he could get more work to do, his happiness level would increase markedly. One who is plotting continually how to get out of things will become miserable. One who is plotting how to get into things has a much better chance of becoming happy. There is, of course, the matter of being forced to play games in which one has no interest. A war into which one is drafted is an excellent example of this. One is not interested in the purposes of the war, and yet one finds himself fighting it. Thus, there must be an additional element. And this element is the power of choice. One could say, then, that life is a game, and that the ability to play a game consists of tolerance for freedom and barriers, and an insight into purposes with the power of choice over participation. These four elements, freedom, barriers, purposes, and power of choice, are the guiding elements of life. There are only two factors above these, and both of them are related to these. The first is the ability to create, with, of course, its negative, the ability to uncreate. And the second is the ability to make a postulate, to consider, to say a thing, and have it be true. This, then, is the broad picture of life, and in bringing life into focus and in making it less confusing, these elements are used in its understanding. Chapter 7. The Parts of Man. The individual man is divisible into three parts. The first of these is the spirit, called in Scientology the Thetan. The second of these parts is the mind. The third of these parts is the body. Probably the greatest discovery of Scientology, and its most forceful contribution to the knowledge of mankind, has been the isolation, description, and handling of the human spirit. Accomplished in July 1952 in Phoenix, Arizona, I established along scientific lines, rather than mere belief, that thing which is the person, the personality, is separable from the body and the mind at will, and without causing bodily death or mental derangement. In ages past, there has been considerable controversy concerning the human spirit or soul, and various attempts to control man have been effective in view of his almost complete ignorance of his own identity. Latterly, spiritualists isolated from the person what they called the astral body, and with this they were able to work for various purposes of their own. In Scientology, the spirit itself was separated from what the spiritualists called the astral body, and there should be no confusion between these two things. As you know that you are where you are at this moment, so you would know if you, a spirit, were detached from your mind and body. Man has not discovered this before because, lacking the technologies of Scientology, he had very little reality upon his detachment from his mind and body. Therefore, he conceived himself to be, at least in part, a mind and a body. The entire cult of communism is based upon the fact that one lives only one life, that there is no hereafter, and that the individual has no religious significance. Man, at large, has been close to this state for at least the last century. The state, condition, is of a very low order, excluding, as it does, all self-recognition. The spirit. The Thetan, spirit, is described in Scientology as having no mass, no wavelength, no energy, and no time or location in space, except by consideration or postulate. The spirit, then, is not a thing. It is the creator of things. The usual residence of the Thetan is in the skull or near the body. A Thetan can be in one of four conditions. 1. The first would be entirely separate from a body or bodies, or even from this universe. 2. The second would be near a body and knowingly controlling the body. 3. The third would be in the body, the skull. 4. And the fourth would be an inverted condition whereby he is compulsively away from the body and cannot approach it. There are degrees, subdivisions, of each one of these four states. The most optimum of these conditions, from the standpoint of man, is the second. A Thetan is subject to deterioration. This is at first difficult to understand, since the entirety of his activity consists of considering or postulating. He uses, through his postulates, various methods of controlling a body. That he does deteriorate is manifest, but that he can at any moment return to an entirety of his ability is also factual. In that he associates beingness with mass and action, he does not consider himself as having an individual identity or name unless he is connected with one or more of the games of life. The processes of Scientology can establish this for the individual with greater or lesser rapidity, and one of the many goals of processing in Scientology is to exteriorize the individual and place him in the second condition above, near a body and knowingly controlling the body, since it has been discovered that he is happier and more capable when so situated. The mind. The mind is a communication and control system between the Thetan and his environment. A Thetan establishes various systems of control so that he can continue to operate a body and, through the body, operate things in the physical universe as well as other bodies. The most obvious portion of the mind is recognizable by anyone not in serious condition. This is the mental image picture. In Scientology, we call this mental image picture a facsimile when it is a photograph of the physical universe sometime in the past. We call this mental image picture a mock-up when it is created by the Thetan or for the Thetan and does not consist of a photograph of the physical universe. We call a mental image picture a hallucination, or more properly, an automaticity, something uncontrolled, when it is created by another and seen by self. Various phenomena connect themselves with this entity called the mind. Some people, closing their eyes, see only blackness. Some people see pictures. Some people see pictures made by body reactions. Some people see only black screens. Others see golden lines. Others see spaces. But the keynote of the entirety of the system called the mind is postulate and perception. Easily 10,000 new, separate mental phenomena, not hitherto seen by earlier observers, have been classified in Scientology and Dianetics, that branch of Scientology which applies only to the mind. The Thetan receives, by the communication system called the mind, various impressions including direct views of the physical universe. In addition to this, he receives impressions from past activities and, most important, he himself being close to a total knowingness, conceives things about the past and future which are independent of immediately present stimuli. The mind is not, in its entirety, a stimulus-response mechanism, as old Marxist psychology, as once taught in universities, would have one believe. The mind has three main divisions. The first of these could be called the analytical mind, the second, the reactive mind, and the third, the somatic mind. The analytical mind. The analytical mind combines perceptions of the immediate environment, of the past via pictures, and estimations of the future into conclusions which are based upon the realities of situations. The analytical mind combines the potential knowingness of the thetan with the conditions of his surroundings and brings him to independent conclusions. This mind could be said to consist of visual pictures, either of the past or the physical universe, monitored by and presided over by the knowingness of a thetan. The keynote of the analytical mind is awareness. One knows what one is concluding and knows what he is doing. The reactive mind. The reactive mind is a stimulus-response mechanism. Ruggedly built and operable in trying circumstances, the reactive mind never stops operating. Pictures of a very low order are taken by this mind of the environment, even in some states of unconsciousness. The reactive mind acts below the level of consciousness. It is the literal stimulus-response mind. Given a certain stimulus, it gives a certain response. The entire subject of Dianetics concerned itself mainly with this one mind. While it is an order of thinkingness, the ability of the reactive mind to conclude rationally is so poor that we find in the reactive mind those various aberrated impulses which are gazed upon as oddities of personality, eccentricities, neuroses, and psychoses. It is this mind which stores up all the bad things that have happened to one and throws them back to him again, in moments of emergency or danger, so as to dictate his actions along lines which have been considered safe before. As there is little thinkingness involved in this, the courses of action dictated by the reactive mind are often not safe, but highly dangerous. The reactive mind is entirely literal in its interpretation of words and actions. As it takes pictures and receives impressions during moments of unconsciousness, a phrase uttered when a blow is struck is likely to be literally interpreted by the reactive mind and become active upon the body and analytical mind at later times. The mildest stage of this would be arduous training, wherein a pattern is laid into the mind for later use under certain given stimuli. A harsher and less workable level is the hypnotic trance condition to which the mind is susceptible. Made impressionable by fixed attention, words can be immediately implanted into the reactive mind, which become operable under re-stimulation at later times. An even lower level in the reactive mind is that one associated with blows, drugs, illness, pain, and other conditions of unconsciousness. Phrases spoken over an anesthetized person can have a later effect upon that person. It is not necessarily true that each and every portion of an operation is painstakingly photographed by the reactive mind of the unconscious patient, but it is true that a great many of these stimuli are registered. Complete silence in the vicinity of a person under anesthetic or a person who is unconscious or in deep pain is mandatory if one would preserve the mental health of that person or patient afterwards. Probably the most therapeutic action which could occur to an individual would be, under Scientology processing, the separation of the thetan from the mind, so that the thetan, under no duress and with total knowingness, could view himself and his mind and act accordingly. However, there is a type of exteriorization which is the most aberrative of all traumatic, mentally injurious actions. This is the condition when an individual is brought, through injury or surgery or shock, very close to death, so that he exteriorizes from body and mind. This exteriorization under duress is sudden and, to the patient, inexplicable, and is in itself very shocking. When this has occurred to an individual, it is certain that he will suffer mentally from the experience afterwards. It could be said that when the reactive mind contains these sudden shocks of exteriorization under duress, attempts to exteriorize the individual later by Scientology are more difficult. However, modern processing has overcome this. The phenomenon of exteriorization under duress is accompanied at times by energy explosions in the various facsimiles of the mind. and these cross-associate in the reactive mind. Therefore, people become afraid of exteriorization and at times are made ill simply by discussing the phenomenon due to the fact that they have exteriorized under duress during some operation or accident. Exteriorization under duress is the characteristic of death itself. Therefore, exteriorization, or the departure of the soul, is generally associated with death in the minds of most people. It is not necessarily true that one is dead because he exteriorizes. And it is definitely not true that exteriorization not accompanied by a shock, pain, or duress is at all painful. Indeed, it is quite therapeutic. The somatic mind. The third portion of the mind is the somatic mind. This is an even heavier type of mind than the reactive mind, since it contains no thinkingness and contains only actingness. The impulses placed against the body by the thetan through various mental machinery arrive at the voluntary, involuntary, and glandular levels. These have set methods of analysis for any given situation and so respond directly to commands given. Unfortunately, the somatic mind is subject to each of the minds higher in scale above it and to the thetan. In other words, the thetan can independently affect the somatic mind. The analytical mind can affect the somatic mind. The reactive mind can affect the somatic mind. Thus we see that the neurons, the glandular system, the muscles and masses of the body are subject to various impulses, each one of a lower order than the next. Thus it is not odd to discover what we call psychosomatic illness. A condition exists here where the thetan does not have an awareness of burdening the somatic mind with various commands or derangements. Neither does the thetan have an awareness of his own participation in the analytical mind causing this action against the body. In that the thetan is seldom aware of the reactive mind, it is possible then for the reactive mind, with its stimulus-response content, to impinge itself directly and without further recourse or advice upon the neurons, muscles, and glandular system of the body. In that the reactive mind can hold a fixed command in place, causing a derangement in the somatic mind, it is possible then for illness to exist, for bizarre pains to be felt, for actual physical twists and aberrations to occur without any conscious knowledge on the part of the thetan. This we call physical illness caused by the mind. In brief, such illness is caused by perceptions received in the reactive mind during moments of pain and unconsciousness. Whether the facsimile in the mind is received while the thetan is awake or unconscious, the resulting mass of the energy picture is energy, just as you see energy in an electric light bulb or from the flames of a fire. At one time it was considered that mental energy was different from physical energy. In Scientology, it has been discovered that mental energy is simply a finer, higher-level physical energy. The test of this is conclusive in that a thetan mocking up, creating mental image pictures and thrusting them into the body can increase the body mass, and by casting them away again can decrease the body mass. This test has actually been made, and an increase of as much as 30 pounds, actually measured on scales, has been added to and subtracted from a body by creating mental energy. Energy is energy. It has different wavelengths and different characteristics. The mental image pictures are capable of reacting upon the physical environment, and the physical environment is capable of reacting upon mental image pictures. Thus, the mind actually consists of spaces, energies, and masses of the same order as the physical universe, if lighter and different in size and wavelength. For a much more comprehensive picture of the mind, one should read Dianetics, the original thesis, and Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. These were written before the discovery of the upper levels of beingness were made, and are a very complete picture of the mind itself, its structure, and what can be done to it and with it. The body. The third part of man is the physical body. This can best be studied in such books as Gray's Anatomy and other anatomical texts. This is the province of the medical doctor and, usually, the old-time psychiatrist or psychologist who were involved in the main in body worship. The body is a purely structural study, and the actions and reactions amongst its various structures are complex and intensely interesting. When Scientology established biophysics, it did so because of the various discoveries which it accumulated concerning mental energy in its reaction against physical energy and the activities which took place in the body because of these interactions. Biophysics only became feasible when it was discovered in Scientology that a fixed electrical field existed surrounding a body, entirely independent of but influenceable by the human mind. The body exists in its own space. That space is created by anchor points, points which are anchored in a space different to the physical universe space around a body. The complexity of these anchor points can cause an independent series of electronic flows which can occasion much discomfort to the individual. The balance structure of the body and even its joint action and physical characteristics can be changed by changing this electrical field which exists at a distance from or within the body. The electrical field is paramount and monitors the actual physical structure of the body. Thus, the body is not only influenced by the three minds, it is influenced as well by its own electrical field. An expert Scientologist can discover this field for the average person and can bring about its adjustment, although this is very far from the primary purpose of the Scientologist. The use of electrical shocks upon a body for any purpose is therefore very dangerous and is not condoned by sensible men. Of course, the use of electrical shock was never intended to be therapeutic, but was intended only to bring about obedience by duress and, as far as it can be discovered, to make the entirety of insanity a horror. Electrical shock deranges the electronic field in the vicinity of the body and is always succeeded by bad health or physical difficulties, and never does otherwise than hasten the death of the person. It has been stated by people using electric shock that if they were denied euthanasia, the right to kill people who were considered to be a burden on a society, they would at least use partial euthanasia in the form of electric shock, brain surgery, and drugs. These quote-unquote treatments, in some large percentage of cases, however, effected euthanasia, as they were expected to do. A knowledge of the mental and physical structure of the body would be necessary in order to treat the body, and this knowledge has not existed prior to Scientology. The medical doctor achieved many results by working purely with structure and biochemical products, and in the field of emergency surgery and obstetrics and orthopedics, he is indispensable in the society. Medicine, however, did not even contain a definition for mind, and is not expected to invade the field which belongs, properly, to Scientology. These three parts of man, the thetan, the mind, and the body, are each one different studies, but they influence each other markedly and continually. Of the three, the senior entity is the thetan, for without the thetan there would be no mind or animation in the body, while without a body or a mind there is still animation and life in the thetan. The thetan is the person. You are you in a body. Parascientology. Many speculations have been made in the field of parascientology. Parascientology includes all of the uncertainties and unknown territories of life which have not been completely explored and explained. However, as studies have gone forward, it has become more and more apparent that the senior activity of life is that of the thetan, and that in the absence of the spirit, no further life exists. In the insect kingdom, it is not established whether or not each insect is ordered by a spirit or whether one spirit orders enormous numbers of insects. It is not established how mutation and evolution occur, if they do. And the general authorship of the physical universe is only speculated upon, since Scientology does not invade the eighth dynamic. See Chapter 4, The Eight Dynamics. Some facts, however, are completely known. 1. The first of these is that the individual himself is a spirit controlling a body via a mind. 2. The second of these is that the thetan is capable of making space, energy, mass, and time. 3. The third of these is that the Thetan is separable from the body without the phenomenon of death and can handle and control a body from well outside it. 4. The fourth of these is that the Thetan does not care to remember the life which he has just lived after he has parted from the body and the mind. 5. The fifth of these is that a person dying always exteriorizes. 6. The sixth of these is that the person, having exteriorized, usually returns to a planet and procures, usually, another body of the same type of race as before. In parascientology, there is much discussion about between lives areas and other phenomena which might have passed at one time or another for heaven or hell. But it is established completely that a Thetan is immortal and that he himself cannot actually experience death and counterfeits it by forgetting. It is adequately manifest that a Thetan lives again and that he is very anxious to put something on the time track, something for the future, in order to have something to come back to. Thus we have the anxieties of sex. There must be additional bodies for the next life. It is obvious that what we create in our societies during this lifetime affects us during our next lifetime. This is quite different than the belief or the idea that this occurs. In Scientology, we have very little to do with forcing people to make conclusions. An individual can experience these things for himself, and unless he can do so, no one expects him to accept them. The manifestation that our hereafter is our next life entirely alters the general concept of spiritual destiny. There is no argument whatever with the tenets of any faith, since it is not precisely stated uniformly by all religions that one immediately goes to a heaven or hell. It is certain that an individual experiences the effect of the civilization, which he has had part in creating, in his next lifetime. In other words, the individual comes back. He has a responsibility for what goes on today, since he will experience it tomorrow. Sex has been overweighted in importance in old psychotherapy, an importance more or less disgraced at this time. Sex is only one of numerous creative impulses. An anxiety about sex, however, occurs when an individual begins to believe that there will not be a body for him to have during the next lifetime. The common denominator of all aberration is cessation of creation. As sex is only one kind of creation and a rather low order of it, it will be seen that unhappiness could stem from various cessations of creation. Death itself is a cessation of creation. One stops creating the identity John Jones and the environment and things of John Jones. He stops because he believes he cannot himself continue this creation without the assistance of a body. Having become dependent upon a mind and a body, the first to do his thinking for him and the second to do his acting, an individual becomes sufficiently morose on the ideas of creation that he can actually bring about the condition of an inability to create. Control. It will be seen that the three parts of man are intimately associated with control. The anatomy of control is start, change, and stop. The loss of control takes place with the loss of pandeterminism. When one becomes too partisan, braces himself too solidly against the remainder of the environment, he no longer controls the environment to the degree that he might, and so is unable to start, change, and stop the environment. It is a scientific definition in Scientology that control consists of start, change, and stop. These three manifestations can be graphed alongside of the apparent cycle of action: create, survive, destroy. Any person is somewhere along this curve. An individual who is bent mainly upon survival is intent usually upon changing things. An individual who is close to being destroyed is bent mainly upon stopping things. An individual who has a free heart and mind about life is bent upon creating things. There could be three things wrong with any person, and these would be the inability to start, the inability to change, the inability to stop. Insanity, for the most part, is an inability to stop. A neurosis is a habit, which, worsening, flies entirely out of control. One is stopped so often in life that he becomes an enemy of stopping. and dislikes stopping so intensely that he himself will not stop things. Neurosis and psychosis of all classes are entirely inabilities to start, to change, or to stop. In the matter of the parts of man, we discover that all things are initiated by the Thetan so far as action, activity, and behavior are concerned. After such an initiation, he can be blunted or warped from course and acted upon in such a way that his attention becomes too fixed along one line or another, and he begins to suffer from these three inabilities. However, each one of the parts of man is subject to the anatomy of control. An individual begins first by being unable himself, and without help, to start, to change, and to stop. Then the mind may become prone to these disabilities and is unable to start, change, or stop at will. Then the body itself can become subject to these three disabilities and is unable to start, to change, and to stop. The oddity, however, is that an environment can so work upon an individual that a Thetan's body becomes disabled through no choice of his own. Similarly, the mind can become disabled through no choice of either the body or the Thetan. But the Thetan himself, beyond observing the effect of various causes and having initiated the thought to be there, can only become disabled by becoming too partisan, by becoming too little pan-determined, and so bringing himself into difficulties. These difficulties, however, are entirely the difficulties of consideration. As the Thetan considers, so he is. In the final analysis, the Thetan has no problems of his own. The problems are always other people's problems, and must exist in the mind or the body or in other people or his surroundings for him to have problems. Thus his difficulties are, in the main, the difficulties of staying in the game and keeping the game going. If a Thetan can suffer from anything, it is being out-created, created against too thoroughly. The manifestations of being out-created would be the destruction of his own creations and the overpowering presence of other creations. Thus, a Thetan can be brought to believe that he is trapped if he is out-created. In past dissertations on the subject of the mind and philosophies of life, there was a great deal of speculation and very little actual proof. Therefore, these philosophies were creations, and one philosopher was at work out-creating another philosopher. In Scientology, we have this single difference. We are dealing with discoveries. The only things created about Scientology are the actual books and works in which Scientology is presented. The phenomena of Scientology are discovered and are held in common by all men and all life forms. There is no effort in Scientology to out-create each and every Thetan that comes along. It is, of course, possible to conceive Scientology as a creation and to conceive that it is overwhelming. It should be viewed otherwise. For it is intended as an assistance to life at large, to enable life to make a better civilization and a better game. Chapter 8. Causation and Knowledge. Scientology is composed of many axioms, self-evident truths. There are some 58 of these axioms, in addition to the 200 more axioms of Dianetics which preceded the Scientology axioms. The first 10 axioms of Scientology are: Axiom 1. Life is basically a static. Definition: a life static has no mass, no motion, no wavelength, no location in space or in time. It has the ability to postulate and perceive. Definition: in Scientology, the word postulate means to cause a thinkingness or consideration. It is a specially applied word and is defined as causative thinkingness. Axiom 2. The static is capable of considerations, postulates, and opinions. Axiom 3. Space, energy, objects, form, and time are the result of considerations made and or agreed upon or not by the static, and are perceived solely because the static considers that it can perceive them. Axiom 4. Space is a viewpoint of dimension. Space is caused by looking out from a point. The only actuality of space is the agreed-upon consideration that one perceives through something, and this we call space. Axiom 5. Energy consists of postulated particles in space. one considers that energy exists and that he can perceive energy. One also considers that energy behaves according to certain agreed-upon laws. These assumptions or considerations are the totality of energy. Axiom 6. Objects consist of grouped particles and also of solid masses. Axiom 7. Time is basically a postulate that space and particles will persist. The rate of their persistence is what we measure with clocks and the motion of heavenly bodies. Axiom 8. The apparency of time is the change of position of particles in space. Axiom 9. Change is the primary manifestation of time. Axiom 10. The highest purpose in this universe is the creation of an effect. These first 10 axioms of Scientology are the most fundamental truths, by which we mean commonly held considerations. Here we have thought and life and the physical universe in their relation one to the other. Regardless of further considerations, ideas, assumptions, and conditions, there lie beneath them these first 10 truths. It is as though one had entered into an honorable bargain with fellow beings to hold these things in common. Once this is done, or once such a contract or agreement exists, one has the fundamentals of a universe. Specialized considerations, based on the above axioms, make one or another kind of universe. The physical universe, which we see around us and in which we live, was created on these fundamentals without regard to who created it. Its creation was agreed upon. In order to perceive it, one must agree that it exists. There are 3 classes of universes. 1. There is first, foremost, and most evident the physical universe of spaces, stars, suns, land, sea, air, and living forms. 2. Then there is the other fellow's universe, which may or may not be agreed upon by his associates. This he holds to himself. The phenomenon of this universe is included in the field of the mind, as described earlier. 3. Then listed last here, but first perceived, is one's own universe. The phenomenon of universes is an interesting one, since one's own universe can be overwhelmed by the universes of others. These, in Scientology, we call valences, extra personalities, selves, apparent beingnesses. Valences and universes are the same thing, essentially. For example, one, while living in the physical universe, can be overpowered by the universe of, let us say, Father. While one still retains his own valence or identity, one is yet acting or thinking or suffering or feeling somewhat like Father. Even though one is by oneself, there is this additional apparent beingness. Although Father is absent, his commands are still present. Thus we get such things as duty, obedience, training, and even education. Each one of these is caused by some part of another universe to a greater or lesser degree. Regardless of how one reacts to universes, he still remains, in some degree, himself. It is the effort of many to struggle against universes or valences. In fact, this is a game, and the essence of games. The totality of the impulse of aberrated people is the effort to separate one's own self as a thetan from the various universes with which he feels himself too intimately associated. One is only oppressed by a universe when he feels he can have nothing of that universe. One is only victimized by Father's universe when one is in protest against Father. One protests against the physical universe only when he feels that he can have no part of it or does not belong in it, or, as in religion, is not looked upon kindly by what he conceives to be the creator of the physical universe. There is a basic law about universes. The postulates of the creator of any universe are the postulates which work in that universe. Thus one may feel uncomfortable in the universe of another. Universes, as considered in games earlier, could be considered the playing fields of life. One plays willingly or one plays unwillingly. When one begins to play unwillingly, he is apt to discover himself victimized by and interiorized into the universe of some game. It is against this phenomenon that a person protests. Consider the matter of a jail. On the surface of it, as Voltaire discovered, a jail provides food and shelter and leisure time. This would seem to be the ambition of many people. But the jail provides as well a restriction without one's consent. The only difference between being in jail and being the king in a castle, so far as liberty is concerned, is one's own desires in the matter and one's own ability to command his environment. As a king in a castle, one would be causative. His will, statement, thinkingness would have an effect upon others. Being in a jail, one is an effect in that the thinkingness of others finds him its target. Here we have, in terms of universes, the most rudimentary example of cause and effect. We must, however, assume, because it is so evident, that an individual only gets into traps and circumstances he intends to get into. Certain it is that having gotten into such a position he may be unwilling to remain in it, but a trap is always preceded by one's own choice of entrance. We must assume a very wide freedom of choice on the part of a Thetan, since it is almost impossible to conceive how a Thetan could get himself trapped even though he consented to it. By actual demonstration, a Thetan goes through walls, barriers, vanishes space, appears anywhere at will, and does other remarkable things. It must be, then, that an individual can be trapped only when he considers that he is trapped. In view of the fact that the totality of existence is based upon his own considerations, we find that the limitations he has must have been invited to himself. Otherwise, they could not be eradicated by the individual under processing, since the only one that is present with the pre-clear is the auditor, and past associates of the pre-clear, while not present, do desensitize under processing in the pre-clear's mind. Therefore, it must have been the pre-clear who kept them there. The pre-clear, by processing, can resolve all of his difficulties without going and finding other persons or consulting other universes. Thus, the totality of entrapment, aberration, even injury, torture, insanity, and other distasteful items are basically considerations a Thetan is making and holding right now, in present time. This must be the case, since time itself is a postulate or consideration on his own part. The greatest philosophical clamor or quarrel has been waged around the subject of knowledge, and there is nothing preposterous on the subject of knowledge that cannot be found in the philosophical texts. The superiority and ascendancy of Scientology depends upon the fact that it has transcended this philosophical quarrel on the subject of knowingness. Scientology contains in itself the basics of knowledge. By knowledge we mean assured belief, that which is known, information, instruction, enlightenment, learning, practical skill. By knowledge we mean data, factors, and whatever can be thought about or perceived. The reason why knowledge has been misunderstood in philosophy is that it is only half the answer. There is no allness to knowledge. By definition, knowledge is that which is perceived or learned or taken from another source. This patently means, then, that when one learns, he is being an effect. We see in Axiom 10 that the highest purpose in this universe is the creation of an effect. This is in direct contradiction to knowledge, although one, of course, can know how to create an effect. Opposed to knowledge, we have the neglected half of existence, which is the creation of knowledge, the creation of data, the creation of thought, the causative consideration, self-evolved ideas as opposed to ideas otherwise evolved. The reason Scientology is such a fascinating study is that it takes apart the other fellow's ideas and permits one to create some of his own. Scientology gives us the common denominators of objects, energies, spaces, universes, livingness, and thought itself. There is cause and effect. Cause could be defined as emanation. It could be defined also for purposes of communication as source point. If you consider a river flowing to the sea, the place where it began would be the source point, or cause, and the place where it went into the sea would be the effect point, and the sea would be the effect of the river. The man firing the gun is cause. The man receiving the bullet is effect. The one making a statement is causing the communication. The one receiving the statement is the effect of the communication. A basic definition of communication is cause-distance effect. Almost all anxieties and upsets in human relations come about through an imbalance of cause and effect. One must be willing at once to cause new data, statements, assumptions, considerations, and to receive ideas, assumptions, considerations. So great is the anxiety of a thetan to cause an effect that he closely approaches those things which can cause an effect upon him. Thus, a thetan becomes trapped. On the face of it, so few thetans make causative data and so many receive data that it would seem, in view of the fact that a thetan can be touched only by his own consideration, that thetans are more anxious for effects than to be cause. However, this is not true in practice. In a game, one seeks to cause an effect and to receive no effect. It is learned, under close experiment, that there is nothing a thetan actually disdains on an effect level. He pretends not to like or enjoy certain effects and protests against them. But he knows very well that the mechanism of protest causes the effect to approach more closely as a general rule. This came about by his repeated failure in games. Insisting on no effect for himself, he lost. Then he had to say he liked the effect. The prevailing anxiety, then, is to be an effect, not to be a cause. The entire subject of responsibility is a study of cause and effect, in that a person who wants no responsibility is anxious to be an effect only, and a person who can assume responsibility must also be willing to be causative. A thetan can be swung into a state of consideration by observing that it is commonly held by others. This keeps him in the universe, and this keeps him being effect. Study, investigation, receiving education, and similar activity are all effect activities and result in the assumption of less responsibility. Thus, while it is true that a thetan cannot actually get into trouble, he can, by agreeing with the current agreed-upon thought in the universe where he finds himself, take a pattern of thinkingness which makes him less effective because he wishes to be an effect. If he feels he must gather all of his data from elsewhere, he is then the effect of knowledge, the effect of universes and postulates, and he tends to reduce his own ability to form or make knowledge. In Scientology, we can communicate in full these circumstances, since we are only calling to attention the pattern which an individual already himself holds. Thus, we are not actually teaching him anything. We are only pointing out things he has already agreed with or himself caused. It is only generally true that an individual is responsible for everything that happens to him. When an individual wishing to cause many interesting effects chooses to go into many universes or traps, he can become confused about what he is doing, where he is, or what it is all about. Scientology points out that this can be seen or changed from a person's own viewpoint to bring about a change in his own condition. As an example, a thetan has come to believe that the right way to get along in life is to do just as Father did. This is an invitation to being in Father's universe. Later on, he changes his mind about this. But he finds himself still in Father's universe and doesn't like it. He would be more effective, more capable, if he were not now in Father's universe. Customarily, in these unenlightened times, he waits for death to separate himself from the environment in which he finds himself and puts up with it until then. It is not necessary to do this now that we have Scientology. He can at any moment, given the proper steerage, vacate any trap in which he finds himself and begin again on a new series of considerations. We cannot then talk about knowledge as a totality. It is a single datum. The thirst for knowledge would be the thirst for other thetans' postulates, and would lead one to forget that he himself has been a party to the making of these postulates, and that he himself had to follow a certain course in order to put himself in reach of other thetans' postulates. Because one is the effect of knowledge, the causing of data, considerations, or facts to come into existence separates one in distance from being an effect. If one is very anxious to be an effect, if this is his basic consideration, he will not take well to causing information to come into existence. But in order to get him out of the traps in which he finds himself, it is necessary to some degree that he does so. Causing few barriers or traps, the individual then loses control over barriers or traps. Wishing to be in effect, of course, he does lose control of barriers and traps. Otherwise, he cannot be entrapped by them. The thing to do to free him from a trap is to find what parts of the trap he himself is willing to create, own, have, or possess. This places the barriers, which can be spaces, energy movements, or obstacles, under his control, and his postulating that he can have or possess this or that causes him to be willing to be or occupy the trap. The moment this occurs, he is no longer in the trap, or even if he is still in it, to some degree he does not object to it and can leave it when he wishes. Civilization and savagery. The way to paralyze a nation entirely and to make it completely ungovernable would be to forbid education of any kind within its borders, and to inculcate into every person within it the feeling that they must not receive any information from anybody about anything. To make a nation governable, it is necessary to hold a kindly view of education and to honor educative persons and measures. To conquer a land, it is not necessarily efficient to overwhelm them with guns. Once this is done, it is necessary to apply educative measures in order to bring about some sort of agreement amongst the people themselves, as well as between the conqueror and the subdued. Only in this way could one have a society, a civilization, or, as we say in Scientology, a smoothly running game. In other words, two extremes could be reached, neither one of which is desirable by the individual. The first extreme could be reached by emphasis only upon self-created data or information. This would bring about not only a lack of interpersonal relations, but also an anxiety to have an effect which would, as it does in barbaric peoples, result in social cruelty unimaginable in a civilized nation. The other extreme would be to forbid in its entirety any self-created information and to condone only data or considerations generated by others than self. Here, we would create an individual with no responsibility, so easily handled that he would be only a puppet. Self-created data is, then, not a bad thing. Neither is education, but one without the other, to hold it in some balance, will bring about a no-game condition or a no-civilization. Just as individuals can be seen by observing nations, so we see the primitive tribesman with his complete contempt for truth and his emphasis on brutality and savagery for others, but not himself, is a no-civilization. And we see at the other extreme China, slavishly dedicated to ancient scholars, incapable of generating within herself sufficient rulers to continue, without bloodshed, a nation. We have noted the individual, who must be the only one who can make a postulate or command, whose authority is dearer to him than the comfort or state of millions that have suffered from such men. Napoleon, Hitler, Kaiser Wilhelm, Frederick of Prussia, Genghis Khan, Attila. We have known, too, the scholar who has studied himself into blindness and is the world's greatest authority on government, or some such thing, who yet cannot himself manage his bank account or a dog with any certainty. Here we have, in either case, a total imbalance. The world shaker is himself unwilling to be any effect of any kind, and all the men named here were arrant personal cowards. And we have the opposite, a man who would not know what you were talking about if you told him to get an idea of his own. We see another example of this in the fundamental laws of warfare. A body of troops, to be effective, must be able to attack and to defend. Its implements must be divided 50% for attack and 50% for defense. In other words, even in a crude activity such as warfare, we find that no successful outcome is possible unless the troops can devote half of their energies to attack and half of them to defense. In the much broader view of life, we discover on any dynamic that success or a game or activity or life itself depends upon being willing to be cause as well as willing to be an effect. He who would give must be willing to receive. He who would receive must be willing to give. When these tenets are violated, the most fundamental principle of human relationships is violated. And the result is a no-game condition such as aberration, insanity, antisocialness, criminality, inactivity, laziness, tiredness, mania, fanaticism, and all the other things against which men protest. But imbalances between cause and effect also enter randomities into the game of life and cannot be neglected in their potential for creating a game. Any information is valuable to the degree that you can use it. In other words, any information is valuable to the degree that you can make it yours. Scientology does not teach you, it only reminds you. For the information was yours in the first place. It is not only the science of life, but it is an account of what you were doing before you forgot what you were doing. Chapter 9. Know and Not Know. It is a mechanism of thinkingness, whether one is postulating or receiving information, that one retains one's ability to know. It is equally important that one retains one's ability to not know. Thought consists entirely of knowing and not knowing, and the shades of gray between. You will discover that most people are trying not to remember. In other words, they are trying to not know. Education can only become burdensome when one is unable to not know it. It is necessary that one be able to create, to receive, to know, and to not know information, data, and thoughts. Lacking any one of these skills, for they are skills no matter how native they are to the individual, one is apt to get into a chaos of thinkingness, or creatingness, or livingness. You can look at any eccentric or aberrated person and discover rapidly, by an inspection of him, which one of these four factors he is violating. He either is unable to know or not know his own created thoughts, or he is unable to know or not know the thoughts of others. Somewhere, for some reason best known to him, in his anxiety to be part of the game, he has lost one of these abilities. Time is a process of knowing in the present and not knowing in the future or the past. Remembering is the process of knowing the past. Prediction is the process of knowing the future. Forgetting is the process of not knowing the past. And living only for today is the process of not knowing the future. Exercises in these various items rehabilitate not only the sanity or ability of the individual, but his general capability in living and playing the game. Chapter 10. The Goal of Scientology. The end object of Scientology is not the making into nothing of all of existence or the freeing of the individual of any and all traps everywhere. The goal of Scientology is making the individual capable of living a better life in his own estimation and with his fellows, and the playing of a better game. Part 2. Scientology Processing. Chapter 11. Scientology Processing. Scientology is applied in many ways to many fields. One particular and specialized method of application of Scientology is its use on individuals and groups of people in addressing physical symptoms deriving from mental or spiritual factors and the improvement of their abilities and intelligence. By processing is meant the verbal exercising of a pre-clear in exact Scientology processes. By pre-clear is meant a person who is receiving processing. There is a great deal of terminology and precision in these processes and their use, and they are not combinable with older mental activities such as psychiatry, psychology, psychoanalysis, yoga, massage, etc. However, these processes are capable of addressing the same ills of the mind as are delineated by older methodology, with the addition that Scientology is alone in its ability to successfully overcome those psychosomatic ills to which it is addressed. It is the only study known which is capable of producing marked and significant increases in intelligence and general ability. Scientology processing, amongst other things, can improve the intelligence quotient of an individual, his ability or desire to communicate, his social attitudes, his capability in domestic harmony, his artistic creativity, his reaction time, and his well-being. An additional sphere of activity allied to processing is preventive Scientology. In this branch of processing, an individual is inhibited or restrained from assuming states lower than he has already suffered from. In other words, the progress of tendencies, anxieties, habits, and deteriorating activities can be halted or their occurrence can be prevented by Scientology. This is done by processing the individual on standard Scientology processes without particular attention to the disability involved. A Scientology practitioner is called an auditor, one who listens, a listener. Scientology processing is called auditing, by which the auditor listens, computes, and commands. The auditor and the pre-clear are together out of doors or in a quiet place where they will not be disturbed, or where they are not being subjected to interrupting influences. The role of the auditor is to give the pre-clear certain and exact commands which the pre-clear can follow and perform. The purpose of the auditor is to increase the ability of the pre-clear. The auditor's code is the governing set of rules for the general activity of auditing. The code follows. The Auditor's Code. 1. Do not evaluate for the pre-clear. 2. Do not invalidate or correct the pre-clear's data. 3. Use the processes which improve the pre-clear's case. 4. Keep all appointments once made. 5. Do not process a pre-clear after 10 p.m. 6. Do not process a pre-clear who is improperly fed. 7. Do not permit a frequent change of auditors. 8. Do not sympathize with the pre-clear. 9. Never permit the pre-clear to end the session on his own independent decision. 10. Never walk off from a pre-clear during a session. 11. Never get angry with a pre-clear. 12. Always reduce every communication lag encountered by continued use of the same question or process. 13. Always continue a process as long as it produces change, and no longer. 14. Be willing to grant beingness to the pre-clear. 15. Never mix the processes of Scientology with those of various other practices. 16. Always remain in good two-way communication with the pre-clear during sessions. The Auditor's Code governs the activity of the auditor during sessions, the time devoted to auditing. The activity of the Scientologist in general is governed by another broader code. The Code of a Scientologist. As a Scientologist, I pledge myself to the Code of Scientology for the good of all. 1. To hear or speak no word of disparagement to the press, public, or pre-clears concerning any of my fellow Scientologists, our professional organization, or those whose names are closely connected to this science. 2. To use the best I know of Scientology to the best of my ability to better my pre-clears, groups, and the world. 3. To refuse to accept for processing and to refuse to accept money from any pre-clear or group I feel I cannot honestly help. 4. To deter to the fullest extent of my power anyone misusing or degrading Scientology to harmful ends. 5. To prevent the use of Scientology in advertisements of other products. 6. To discourage the abuse of Scientology in the press. 7. To employ Scientology to the greatest good of the greatest number of dynamics. 8. To render good processing, sound training, and good discipline to those students or peoples entrusted to my care. 9. To refuse to impart the personal secrets of my pre-clears. 10. To engage in no unseemly disputes with the uninformed on the subject of my profession. As it can be seen, both of these codes are designed to protect the pre-clear as well as Scientology and the auditor in general. As these codes evolve from many years of observation and experience by a great number of people, it can be said that they are intensely important and are probably complete. Failure to observe them has resulted in a failure of Scientology. Scientology can do what it can do only when it is used within the limits of these two codes. Thus, it can be seen that the interjection of peculiarities or practices by the auditor into Scientology processing can actually nullify and eradicate the benefits of that processing. Any hope or promise in Scientology is conditional upon its good use by the individual and its use in particular within the limits of these two codes. Chapter 12. Beingness, Doingness, and Havingness. The game of life demands that one assumes a beingness in order to accomplish a doingness in the direction of havingness. Chapter 3. The Conditions of Existence. If you ask an auditor how these work in processing, he will tell you that there is a specialized form of each of these conditions. Beingness equals identity. The processing form of beingness is identity. To achieve a betterment of beingness and the granting of beingness, the auditor remedies with processing the scarcity of identities of the preclear. The preclear is often found in valences, other identities, his father's or mother's or marital partners, or any or all of thousands of possible people. He is unable to achieve or obtain, he thinks, enough identity or an identity of his own. He decries or criticizes the identities of others, fails to grant beingness to them. He himself cannot obtain enough identity to feel he has an identity. Identity is so scarce that it's too valuable. Nobody must have one. To be with such a person is therefore an uncomfortable experience, since he does not credit our identity, does not grant us beingness. The cure for this is elementary. Let us say he is obviously in father's valence, identity. He got into father's valence when he found he could get no attention from mother. Observing that father got some of her attention, he took father's identity. However, let us say he didn't like father. The auditor finds him hating himself. Himself is really father. A clever auditor would see that while he was in father's valence, it was really mother's attention that was sought. See later identities, valences. The auditor does not inform his preclear of such a finding. He asks the preclear to lie about, lowest form of creativity, identities which would attract mother's attention. Then, when the preclear can do this, the auditor would have him invent identities which would attract mother's attention. Suddenly, the preclear would be no longer in father's valence. However, he would have been not only in father's, but also in mother's valence. So the same process would have to be done on father. Lie about, the auditor would say, identities which would attract father's attention. Then invent one until the preclear had many and would no longer be in mother's valence. Solving father and mother valences is fundamental, since most people are somewhat in them or revolted from them. But people can be stuck in all sorts of identities, even bedposts when humans are too valuable to be used. The rule is that the more a person is stuck in a valence or identity, the fewer he conceives to exist, and the harder he thinks it is to get attention. Thus, he can become exhibitionistic, displaying himself too thoroughly, being too much there at all times. Or he can become dispersed, hiding himself, being vague, not there most of the time. People err in identity, in being too apparent or too little apparent. The remedy of either is the remedy of their scarcity of identity. Identity and attention. One needs an identity to play the game, as covered later, game and no-game conditions, but mainly to get attention. A being looks at things. To balance the flow of his attention, he feels he must also be looked at. Thus, he becomes attention-hungry. For instance, unlike races of Asia and Africa, the white does not usually believe he can get attention from matter or objects. The other cultures believe for the most part, and it is all a matter of consideration, that rocks, trees, walls, etc. can give them attention. The white race seldom believes this, and so is likely to become anxious about people. Thus, the white saves people, prevents famine, flood, disease, and revolution. For people, as the only purveyors of attention, are scarce. The white goes further. He often believes he can get attention only from whites, and that attention from other races is worthless. Thus, the other cultures are not very progressive, but, by and large, saner. And the white race is progressive but more frantic. The other cultures do not understand white concern for bad conditions, since what are a few million dead men? There are plenty of identities, and there is plenty of attention, they think. The white can't understand them, nor can they understand the white. Attention and identity form a group of two. Attention makes space. Identity closes space. Attention is a method of knowing. Inattention is a method of not knowing. Identity is a method of making known. Lack of identity is a method of making unknown. Valences. The whole study of valences is a fascinating one. A valence is defined as a false identity assumed unwittingly. An identity is modified by valences. People who can be nobody may try to be everybody. People who are seeking a way out of scarcity of identity may become fixed in false valences. Nations can become fixed in valences of countries they have conquered in war, etc., etc. A rule is that a person assumes the identity of that which gets attention. Another rule is that the person assumes the identity of that which makes him fail, for he gave it his attention, didn't he? There is a basic personality, a person's own identity. He colors or drowns this with valences as he loses or wins in life. He can be dug up. Identities, valences. There are 4 identities, or valences. Own valence. When one is in his own valence, he is said to be himself. As he departs from his own identity, he comes into the following. Exchanged valence. One has directly superimposed the identity of another on his own. Example, daughter becomes own mother to some degree. Remedy, one directly runs out mother. Attention valence. One has become the valence B because one wants attention from C. Example, one becomes mother because mother received attention from father while self did not. Remedy, run out father, even though preclear appears in valence of mother. Synthetic valence. One takes a valence about which he has been told. Example, mother tells child false things about father, accuses child of being like father, with result that child is forced into father's valence. Remedy, run out mother, even though preclear does not seem to be near mother's valence. Do equals effect. Doing can be defined as the action of creating an effect. An effect in creation is action. An auditor processing a preclear would always use effect processes to increase doingness. What effect could you create on father? Would be a typical auditor question. If a preclear is fixated by books, a machine, a tool, a person, the auditor asks him to lie about, then invent effects he could create upon it. At first, the preclear may be able to think of none. Then, as the process is continued, he may become wildly imaginative or even cruel. Further running will bring the preclear into a more comfortable frame of mind. Criminals or maniacs are people who are frantically attempting to create an effect long after they know they cannot. They cannot then create decent effects, only violent effects. Neither can they work, do. Despair of creating an effect brings about aberration and irrational conduct. It also brings about laziness and carelessness. Command of attention is necessary to creating an effect. Therefore, when one conceives he cannot easily get attention, he seeks to create stronger effects. He creates effects to get attention. He gets attention to create effects. As in Axiom 10, the creation of an effect is the highest purpose in this universe. Thus, when one cannot create effects, he has no purpose, and thus it works out in life. It may be all right to be a stern and unrelenting superior or parent, but such create laziness and criminals. If one cannot have an effect created upon one, and one is known to another, very definitely harmful results will ensue. As one believes he creates the least effect upon unconscious or dead people, these, as in hospitals or China, become the subject of much aberrated activity. What effect could you create on an unconscious person or a dead person? Asked over and over by an auditor, obtained some astonishing results. An artist stops his work when he believes he can no longer create an effect. A person actually dies for lack of effect. But security often depends on being able to create no effect. The whole subject of survival is bound up in no effect. Obviously, those things on which no effect can be made survive. If one is anxious about survival, a foolish thing, for he can't do anything else, he becomes anxious to have about him things which resist all effects. But as his only anxiety is about the survival of a valence or identity, remedy of the scarcity of these can resolve the matter. Another cycle of action, containing also the classes of effects, is start, change, and stop. This is the definition of control. Havingness. As there must be a playing field for a game to be held, see later, game and no-game conditions, so there must be havingness. One must be able to possess. There are millions of methods of possession in life. The obvious one becomes overlooked. If one can see a thing, he can have it, if he thinks he can. The degree to which one can live is the degree to which one can own. To own is not to label or cart away. To own is to be able to see, or touch, or occupy. One loses to the degree he is forbidden to have. But to play a game, one must be able to believe he can't have. Effect and have. Effect and have form a pair like attention and identity. An effect should be on or against something, thus havingness. If one's attention never meets anything, he doesn't always like it. Thus he wants objects. Effect makes distance. Have shortens distance. Problems. Man, or any life form in this universe, seems to love problems. A problem is more important than freedom. Problems keep up interest. When a man has a problem very thoroughly and can't solve it, he really has too few problems. He needs more. The insanity amongst the idle is a matter of problem scarcity. A problem is defined as two or more purposes in opposition, or intention versus intention. Out of the conditions of existence can come many complex problems. If a man had all the attention in the world, he would be unhappy. If he had all the identities possible, he would still be unhappy. If he could blow up Earth or create any other huge effect he wanted without limit, he would be miserable or insane. If he could own everything everywhere, he would be dulled to apathy. Or so it seems. For these conditions of existence are all subordinate to the need of problems by current Scientology reasoning and results. Thus, to have a person lie about problems or invent problems of the same size as the ones he has or the valence he is in, or to invent data of the same or a different size as the one he is fixed upon, is to make a well man. Probably the problem is the antidote to unconsciousness. It is certainly the antidote for boredom. But in making up the problems of life, he consults the conditions of existence, be, do, have, and their necessary partner in every case, attention. Chapter 13. Self-determinism and pan-determinism. Self-determinism. Self-determinism is a condition of determining the actions of self. It is a first, self-dynamic action and leaves the remaining 7 undetermined or, in actuality, in opposition to the self. Thus, if one wants to take on the rest of life in a free-for-all fight, one could be entirely insistent upon total self-determinism. As the remainder of the dynamics must have a say in one's self to function, they fight at once any attempt at total self-determinism. Pan-determinism. Pandeterminism means determining the action of self and others. It means wider determinism than self. In an aberrated fashion, we see this in an effort to control all others to aggrandize, make important, self. Pandeterminism is a cross-determinism, or determinism of two sides. If one controls, monitors, both sides of a chess game, one is above the game. One is self-determined, then, in any situation in which he is fighting. He is pan-determined in any situation which he is controlling. To become pan-determined, rather than only self-determined, it is necessary to view both sides. A problem is an intention versus intention. It is then something that has two opposing sides. By creating problems, one tends to view both sides in opposition, and so becomes pan-determined. Thus, a problem only appears to be necessary to man. The problem is the closest reality man has to pan-determinism. In processing, the invention of problems then shows a wider view and so exteriorizes one from difficulty. Chapter 14. Game and No-Game Conditions. In Scientology, the most important single elements to the auditor are game conditions and no-game conditions. Reason. Reason. All games are aberrative. All processing is directed toward establishing game conditions. Little or no processing is directed toward no-game conditions. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance to know exactly what these are, for one could be superficial about it and lose. Rule. Rule. All games are aberrative. Some are fun. Elements of games. The elements of games to the auditor are: a game consists of freedoms, barriers, and purposes. In a game, one's own team or self must receive no effect and must deliver an effect upon the other team or opponent. A game should have space and, preferably, a playing field. A game is played in the same time continuum for both sides, all players. A game must have something which one does not have in order for it to be won. Some part of the dynamics must be excluded for a game condition to exist. The amount of the dynamics excluded represents the tone of the game. Games occur only when there is intention opposing intention, purpose opposing purpose. A scarcity of games forces the pre-clear to accept less desirable games. Participation in any game, whether it be the game of sick man, jealous wife, or polo, is preferable to being in a no-game condition. The type of game entered by a person is determined by his consideration as to how much and what kind of an effect he may receive while trying to deliver an effect. Games are the basic mechanism for continuing attention. To play a game, one must be able to not know his past and future and not know his opponent's complete intentions. Game conditions. Game conditions are attention, identity, effect on opponents, no effect on self. Can't have on opponents and goals and their areas. Have on self, tools of play, own goals and field. Purpose, problems of play, self-determinism, opponents, the possibility of loss, the possibility of winning, communication, non-arrival, control. No-game conditions. No-game conditions are knowing all, not knowing everything, serenity, namelessness, no effect on opponent, effect on self or team, others have everything, self can't have, solutions, pandeterminism, friendship with all, understanding, total communication, no communication of any kind whatsoever, win, lose, no universe, no playing field, arrival, death. Process only with those conditions listed as game conditions. Do not process directly toward those conditions listed as no-game conditions. So doing, the auditor will run out, erase, the aberrative effect of games and restore an ability to play a game. Chapter 15. Auditing. Procedures and processes. The conditions of auditing. Certain definite conditions must prevail, and a certain methodology must be followed in order that processing may be beneficial to its fullest extent. Probably the first condition is a good grasp of Scientology and its mission in the world. The second condition would be a relaxed state of mind on the part of the auditor and the confidence that his use of Scientology upon the pre-clear will not produce a harmful result. The third requisite should be finding a pre-clear. By this, it is literally meant that one should discover somebody willing to be processed, and having discovered one so willing, should then make sure that he is aware that he is there being processed. The fourth requisite would be a quiet place in which to audit, with every precaution taken that the pre-clear will not be interrupted or burst in upon or unduly startled during processing. Auditing procedures. All requisites for auditing from here on are entirely concerned with procedures and processes. By auditing procedure is meant the general model of how one goes about addressing a pre-clear. This includes an ability to place one question, worded exactly the same way over and over again, to the pre-clear, no matter how many times the pre-clear has answered the question. It should include the ability to acknowledge with a good and all right every time a pre-clear executes or completes the execution of a command. It should include the ability to accept a communication from the pre-clear. When the pre-clear has something to say, the auditor should pay some attention to the communication and should acknowledge the fact that he has received the pre-clear's communication. Procedure also includes the ability to sense when the pre-clear is being overstrained by processing or is being unduly annoyed, and to handle such crises in the session to prevent the pre-clear from leaving. An auditor should have the ability of handling startling remarks or occurrences by the pre-clear. An auditor should also have the knack of preventing the pre-clear from talking obsessively, since prolonged conversation markedly reduces the havingness of the pre-clear. The sooner long dissertations by the pre-clear are cut off, the better for the session, the period of time devoted to auditing, in general. Processes, as distinct from procedures, consist of utilizing the principle of the gradient scale to the end of placing the pre-clear in better control of himself, his mind, the people, and the universe around him. By gradient scale is meant a proceeding from simplicity toward greater difficulty, giving the pre-clear always no more than he can do, but giving him as much as he can do until he can handle a great deal. The idea here is to give the pre-clear nothing but wins and to refrain from giving the pre-clear losses in the game of processing. Thus, it can be seen that processing is a team activity and is not itself a game, whereby the auditor opposes and seeks to defeat the pre-clear, and the pre-clear seeks to defeat the auditor. For when this condition exists, little results in processing. Exact processes. The earliest stage of auditing consists in taking over control of the pre-clear, so as to restore to the pre-clear more control of himself than he has had. The most fundamental step is, then, location, whereby the pre-clear is made to be aware of the fact that he is in an auditing room, that an auditor is present, and that the pre-clear is being a pre-clear. Those conditions will become quite apparent if one realizes that it would be very difficult for a son to process a father. A father is not likely to recognize, in his auditor, anything else than the boy he raised. Therefore, the father would have to be made aware of the fact that the son was a competent practitioner before the father could be placed under control in processing. Look at me. Who am I? One of the most elementary commands in Scientology is, look at me. Who am I? After a pre-clear has been asked to do this many times, until he can do so quickly and accurately and without protest, it can be said that the pre-clear will have found the auditor. Start, change, and stop. The pre-clear is asked by the auditor to control, which is to say, start, change, and stop, the anatomy of control, anything he is capable of controlling. In a very bad case, this might be a very small object being pushed around on a table, being started and changed and stopped each time, specifically and only at the auditor's command, until the pre-clear realizes that he himself can start, change, and stop the object. When I say start, you start the object in that direction. Auditor indicates direction. Okay? Start. When the pre-clear has, did you start the object? When I say change, you change the object's position from location designated by auditor to location designated by auditor. Okay? Change. When the pre-clear has, did you change the object? I'm going to tell you to get the object moving in that direction. Auditor indicates direction. When I say stop, you stop the object. Okay? Get the object moving. Stop. When the pre-clear has, did you stop the object? In all of his commands, the auditor must be careful never to give a second command before the first one has been fully obeyed. Sometimes 4 or 5 hours spent in this exercise are very well spent on a very difficult pre-clear. The pre-clear is then asked to start, change, and stop his own body under the auditor's specific and precise direction. The auditor substitutes body in place of object in the above commands. A pre-clear in this procedure is walked around the room and is made to start, change the direction of, and stop his body, one of these at a time in emphasis, until he realizes that he can do so with ease. Only now could it be said that a session is well in progress or that a pre-clear is securely under the auditor's command. It should be noted, especially, that the goal of Scientology is better self-determinism for the pre-clear. This rules out at once hypnotism, drugs, alcohol, or other control mechanisms used by other and older therapies. It will be found that such things are not only not necessary, but they are in direct opposition to the goals of greater ability for the pre-clear. The principal points of concentration for the auditor now become 1. The ability of the pre-clear to have. 2. The ability of the pre-clear to not know. 3. And the ability of the pre-clear to play a game. An additional factor is the ability of the pre-clear to be himself and not a number of other people, such as his father, his mother, his marital partner, or his children. See earlier, beingness, doingness, and havingness. Have. Trio. The ability of the pre-clear is increased by addressing havingness with the process known as the trio. These are 3 questions, or rather, commands. 1. Look around here and tell me what you could have. 2. Look around here and tell me what you would permit to remain in place. 3. Look around and tell me with what you could dispense. Number 1 above is used usually about 10 times. Then number 2 is used 5 times, and number 3 is used once. This ratio of 10, 5, and 1 would be an ordinary or routine approach to havingness. The end in view is to bring the pre-clear into a condition whereby he can possess or own or have whatever he sees without further conditions, ramifications, or restrictions. This is the most therapeutic of all processes, elementary as it might seem. It is done without too much two-way communication or discussion with the pre-clear, and it is done until the pre-clear can answer questions 1, 2, and 3 equally well. It should be noted at once that 25 hours of use of this process by an auditor upon a pre-clear, over a period of several sessions, usually brings about a very high rise in tone. By saying 25 hours, it is intended to give the idea of the length of time the process should be used. As it is a strain on the usual person to repeat the same question over and over, it will be seen that an auditor should be well disciplined or very well trained before he audits. In the case of a pre-clear who is very unable, can't have is substituted for have in the first question above for a few hours, until the pre-clear is ready for the trio in its have form. Selecting categories, which are the 8 dynamics, and selecting them as they seem to be put forward by the pre-clear, one asks what these categories can't have. One does not stress what the individual himself can't have, for to do so would make the individual postulate against himself. Let us suppose that the pre-clear is a man and that the category women had been chosen. The auditing question would then be, look around here and tell me what women can't have. On the male pre-clear, of course, look around here and tell me what men can't have would also be runnable, since the truth of the matter is the pre-clear is not a male but has a male body. On other categories, the question is the same. Look around here and tell me what category can't have. This can't is the plus and minus aspect of all thought, and in Scientology is called by a specialized word, dichotomy. Not know. The rehabilitation of the ability of the pre-clear to not know is also rehabilitation of the pre-clear in the time stream, since the process of time consists of knowing the present moment and not knowing the past and not knowing the future simultaneously. This process, like all other Scientology processes, is repetitive. The process is run, ordinarily, only after the pre-clear is in very good condition and is generally run in an exterior, well-inhabited place. Here, the auditor, without exciting public comment, indicates a person and asks the pre-clear, "Can you not know something about that person?" The auditor does not permit the pre-clear to not know things which the pre-clear already doesn't know. The pre-clear not knows only those things which are visible and apparent about the person. This is also run on other objects in the environment, such as walls, floors, chairs, and other things. The auditor should not be startled when, for the pre-clear, large chunks of the environment start to disappear. This is ordinary routine, and, in effect, the pre-clear should make the entirety of the environment disappear at his own command. The environment does not disappear for the auditor. The end goal of this not-know process is the disappearance of the entire universe under the pre-clear's control, but only for the pre-clear. It will be discovered while running this that the pre-clear's havingness may deteriorate. If this happens, he was not run enough on the trio before he was run on this process. It is only necessary in such a case to intersperse, "Look around here and tell me what you could have," with the not know command to keep the pre-clear in good condition. Drop of havingness is manifested by nervous agitation, obsessive talk, or semi-unconsciousness or dopiness on the part of the pre-clear. These manifestations only indicate reduction of havingness. The reverse of the question here is, tell me something that you would be willing to have that person, indicated by the auditor, not know about you. Both sides of the question have to be run, audited. This process can be continued for 25 hours, or even 50 or 75 hours of auditing with considerable benefit, so long as it does not react too violently upon the pre-clear in terms of loss of havingness. It should be noted, in running either the trio or not know on a pre-clear, that the pre-clear may exteriorize. In other words, it may become apparent, either by his observation or that the pre-clear informs him, that the auditor has exteriorized a pre-clear. In Chapter 7, The Parts of Man, there is an explanation of this phenomenon. In modern auditing, the auditor does not do anything odd about this beyond receive and be interested in the pre-clear's statement of the fact. The pre-clear should not be permitted to become alarmed, since it is a usual manifestation. A pre-clear is in better condition and will audit better exteriorized than in his head. An actual ability to not know is an ability to erase the past by self-command, without suppressing it with energy or going into any other method, and is necessary to help the pre-clear. It is the primary rehabilitation in terms of knowingness. Forgetting is a lower manifestation than not knowingness. Play a game. The third ability to be addressed by the auditor is the ability of the pre-clear to play a game. First and foremost in the requisites to play a game is the ability to control. One must be able to control something in order to participate in a game. Therefore, the general rehabilitation of control, by starting, changing, and stopping things, is a rehabilitation in the ability to play a game. When a pre-clear refuses to recover, it is because the pre-clear is using his state as a game and does not believe that there is any better game for him to play than the state he is in. He may protest if this is called a game. Nevertheless, any condition will surrender if the auditor has the pre-clear invent similar conditions or even tell lies about the existing condition. Inventing games, or inventing conditions, or inventing problems alike rehabilitate the ability to play a game. Chief amongst these various rehabilitation factors are control, start, change, and stop, problems, and the willingness to overwhelm or be overwhelmed. One ceases to be able to have games when one loses control over various things, when one becomes short of problems, and when one is unwilling to be overwhelmed, in other words, to lose, or to overwhelm, to win. It will be found while running havingness, as in the trio above, that one may run down the ability to play a game, since havingness is in part the reward of a game. In the matter of problems, it will be seen that these are completely necessary to the playing of a game. The anatomy of a problem is intention versus intention. This is, in essence, the purpose of all games, to have two sides, each one with an opposed intention. Technically, a problem is two or more purposes in conflict. It is very simple to detect whether or not the pre-clear is suffering from a scarcity of games. The pre-clear who needs more games clutches to himself various present-time problems. If an auditor is confronted with a pre-clear who is being obsessed by a problem in present time, he knows two things. One, that the pre-clear's ability to play a game is low. Two, that he must run an exact process at once to rehabilitate the pre-clear in session. It often happens at the beginning of an auditing session that the pre-clear has encountered a heavy present-time problem between sessions. The pre-clear must always be consulted before the session is actually in progress, as to whether or not he has anything worrying him. To a pre-clear who is worried about some present-time situation or problem, no other process has any greater effectiveness than the following one. Problems of comparable magnitude. The auditor, with a very brief discussion of the problem, asks the pre-clear to invent a problem of comparable magnitude. He may have to reword this request to make the pre-clear understand it completely, but the auditor wants, in essence, the pre-clear to invent or create a problem he considers similar to the problem he has. If the pre-clear is unable to do this, it is necessary then to have him lie about the problem which he has. Lying is the lowest order of creativeness. After he has lied about the problem for a short time, it will be found that he will be able to invent problems. He should be made to invent problem after problem until he is no longer concerned with his present time problem. The auditor should understand that a pre-clear who is now willing to do something about the problem has not been run long enough on the invent a problem of comparable magnitude. As long as the pre-clear is attempting to do something about the problem is still of obsessive importance to him. No session can be continued successfully until such a present-time problem is entirely flat. And it has been the experience that when a present-time problem was not completely eradicated by this process, the remainder of the session, or indeed the entire course of auditing, may be interrupted. When a pre-clear does not seem to be advancing under auditing, a thing which he does markedly and observedly, it must then be supposed that the pre-clear has a present-time problem which has not been eradicated and which must be handled in auditing. Although the auditor gives the pre-clear to understand that he, too, believes this present-time problem is extremely important, the auditor should not believe that this process will not handle any present-time problem, since it will. This process should be done on some pre-clears in company with the trio. If the pre-clear is asked to lie about or invent a problem of comparable magnitude, and while doing so becomes agitated or unconscious, or begins to talk wildly or obsessively, it must be assumed that he will have to have some havingness run on him, until the agitation or manifestation ceases, so that the problems of comparable magnitude process can be resumed. Overwhelming. Another aspect of the ability to play a game is the willingness to win and the willingness to lose. An individual has to be willing to be cause or willing to be an effect. As far as games are concerned, this is reduced to a willingness to win and a willingness to lose. People become afraid of defeat and afraid of failure. The entire anatomy of failure is only that one's postulates or intentions are reversed in action. For instance, one intends to strike a wall and strikes it. That is a win. One intends not to strike a wall and doesn't strike it. That is again a win. One intends not to strike a wall and strikes it. That is a lose. One intends to strike a wall and can't strike it. This is again a lose. It will be seen in this, as well as other things, that the most significant therapy there is changing the mind. All things are as one considers they are, and in no other way. If it is sufficiently simple to give the definition of winning and losing, so it is simple to process the matter. This condition is best expressed in processing by a process known as overwhelming. An elementary way of running this is to take the pre-clear outside where there are numbers of people to observe and, indicating a person, ask the pre-clear, "What could overwhelm that person?" When the pre-clear answers this, he is asked about the same person, "What could that person overwhelm?" He is then asked, as the third question, "Look around here and tell me what you could have." These three questions are run one after the other. Then another person is chosen, and then the three questions are asked again. This process can be varied in its wording, but the central idea must remain as above. The pre-clear can be asked, "What would you permit to overwhelm that person?" And "What would you permit that person to overwhelm?" And, of course, "Look around here and tell me what you could have." This is only one of a number of possible processes on the subject of overwhelming. But it should be noted that asking the pre-clear to think of things which would overwhelm him could be fatal to the case. Where overwhelming is handled, the pre-clear should be given a detached view. Separateness. As a counterposition to havingness processes, trio, but one which is less therapeutic, is separateness. One asks the pre-clear to look around and discover things which are separate from you. This is repeated over and over. It is, however, destructive of havingness, even though it will occasionally prove beneficial. Use of processes. It will be seen that havingness, barriers, not knowingness, being in present time and not in the past or the future, purposes, problems, antagonists or intention versus intention, and separateness, freedom, well cover the anatomy of games. It is not to be thought, however, that havingness addresses itself only to games. Many other factors enter into it. In amongst all of these, it is of the greatest single importance. In these days of Scientology, one addresses the subjective self, the mind, as little as possible. One keeps the pre-clear alert to the broad environment around him. An address to the various energy patterns of the mind is less beneficial than exercises which directly approach other people or the physical universe. Therefore, asking a pre-clear to sit still and answer the question, "What could you have?" when it is answered by the pre-clear from his experience or on the score of things which are not present, is found to be non-therapeutic and is found instead to decrease the ability and intelligence of the pre-clear. This is what is known as a subjective, inside the mind only, process. These are the principal processes which produce marked gains. There are other processes, and there are combinations of processes, but these given here are the most important. A Scientologist, knowing the mind completely, can of course do many tricks with the conditions of people to improve them. One of these is the ability to address a psychosomatic illness, such as a crippled leg, which, having nothing physically wrong with it, is yet not usable. The auditor could ask the pre-clear, "Tell me a lie about your leg," with a possible relief of the pain or symptoms. Asking the pre-clear repeatedly, "Look around here and tell me something your leg could have," would undoubtedly release the somatic. Asking the pre-clear with the bad leg, "What problem could your leg be to you?" or requiring him to invent a problem of comparable magnitude to your leg would produce a distinct change in the condition of the leg. This would apply to any other body part or organ. It would also apply, strangely enough, to the pre-clear's possessions. If a pre-clear had a vehicle or cart which was out of repair or troublesome to him, one could ask him, "What problem could a cart be to you?" Requesting him to invent many such problems, one would discover that he had solved his problems with the cart. There is the phenomenon in existence that the pre-clear already has many set games. When one asks him to give the auditor problems, he already has the manifestations of as-ising or erasing taking place. Thought erases. Therefore, the number of problems or games the pre-clear could have would be reduced by asking him to recount those which he already has. Asking the pre-clear to recount or describe his symptoms is far less than therapeutic and may result in a worsening of those symptoms, contrary to what some schools of thought have believed in the past, but which accounts for their failures. Auditing. Things to avoid. There are specific things which one must avoid in auditing. These follow. 1. Significances. The easiest thing a thetan does is change his mind. The most difficult thing he does is handle the environment in which he finds himself situated. Therefore, asking a thetan to run out various ideas is a fallacy. It is a mistake. Asking the pre-clear to think over something can also be an error. Asking a pre-clear to do exercises which concern his mind alone can be entirely fatal. A pre-clear is processed between himself and his environment. If he is processed between himself and his mind, he is processed up too short a view, and his condition will worsen. 2. Two-way communication. There can be far too much two-way communication or far too much communication in an auditing session. Communication involves the reduction of havingness. Letting a pre-clear talk on and on, or obsessively, is to let a pre-clear reduce his havingness. The pre-clear who is permitted to go on talking will talk himself down tone scale and into a bad condition. It is better for the auditor simply and discourteously to tell a pre-clear to shut up than to have the pre-clear run himself out of the bottom on havingness. You can observe this for yourself if you permit a person who is not too able to talk about his troubles to keep on talking. He will begin to talk more and more hectically. He is reducing his havingness. He will eventually talk himself down the tone scale into apathy, at which time he will be willing to tell you, as you insist upon it, that he feels better, when as a matter of fact, he is actually worse. Asking a pre-clear, "How do you feel now?" can reduce his havingness, since he looks over his present time condition and as-ises some mass. 3. Too many processes. It is possible to run a pre-clear on too many processes in too short a time with a reduction of the pre-clear's recovery. This is handled by observing the communication lag of the pre-clear. It will be discovered that the pre-clear will space his answers to a repeated question differently with each answer. When a long period ensues between his answer to the question a second time, he is said to have a communication lag. The communication lag is the length of time between the placing of the question by the auditor and the answering of that exact question by the pre-clear. It is not the length of time between the placing of the question by the auditor and some statement by the pre-clear. It will be found that the communication lag lengthens and shortens on a repeated question. The question, on the 10th time it has been asked, may detect no significant lag. This is the time to stop asking that question, since it now has no appreciable communication lag. One can leave any process when the communication lag for 3 successive questions is the same. In order to get from one process to another, one employs a communication bridge, which to a marked degree reduces the liability of too many processes. A communication bridge is always used. Before a question is asked, The pre-clear should have the question discussed with him and the wording of the question agreed upon as though he were making a contract with the auditor. The auditor says that he is going to have the pre-clear do certain things and finds out if it's all right with the pre-clear if the auditor asks him to do these things. This is the first part of a communication bridge. It precedes all questions, but when one is changing from one process to another, the bridge becomes a bridge indeed. One levels out the old process by asking the pre-clear whether or not he doesn't think it is safe to leave that process now. One discusses the possible benefit of the process and then tells the pre-clear that he is no longer going to use that process. Now he tells the pre-clear he is going to use a new process, describes the process, and gets an agreement on it. When the agreement is achieved, then he uses this process. The communication bridge is used at all times. The last half of it, the agreement on a new process, is always used before any process is begun. 4. Failure to handle the present time problem. Probably more cases are stalled or found unable to benefit in processing because of the neglect of the present time problem, as covered above, than any other single item. 5. Unconsciousness, dopiness, or agitation on the part of the pre-clear is not a mark of good condition. It is a loss of havingness. The pre-clear must never be processed into unconsciousness or dopiness. He should always be kept alert. The basic phenomenon of unconsciousness is a flow which has flowed too long in one direction. If one talks too long at somebody, he will render him unconscious. In order to wake up the target of all that talk, it is necessary to get the unconscious person to do some talking. It is simply necessary to reverse any flow to make unconsciousness disappear. But this is normally cared for in modern Scientology by running the trio above. Epilogue: The future of Scientology. With man now equipped with weapons sufficient to destroy all mankind on earth, the emergence of a new religion capable of handling man is vital. Scientology is such a religion. It was born in the same crucible as the atomic bomb. The basic intelligence of Scientology came from nuclear physics, higher mathematics, and the understanding of the ancients in the East. Scientology can do exactly what it says it can do. With Scientology, man can prevent insanity, criminality, and war. It is for man to use. It is for the betterment of man. Today, the primary race of Earth is not between one nation and another. The only race that matters at this moment is the one being run between Scientology and the atomic bomb. The history of man, as has been said by well-known authorities, may well depend upon which one wins. Finis.